Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time I noticed the chandelier cord spinning, I blamed it on the old ventilation system. Houses from the 60s had their quirks, especially neglected ones with decades of accumulated dust settling into every corner like sediment in a forgotten riverbed. I'd bought the two-story colonial on Maple Street for next to nothing, a weekend project that would keep my hands busy, while my mind sorted through the wreckage of my recent divorce. The realtor had been eager to close, her manicured fingers drumming against the contract as she explained the previous owner's sudden departure. "Heart attack," she'd said, though her eyes avoided mine when she mentioned how quickly the estate wanted to sell. I should have paid attention to that hesitation, the way she hurried through the walkthrough, barely pausing at the peculiar details that would later consume my thoughts. But I was focused on the bones of the place. Solid oak floors beneath the yellowed linoleum, crown molding under layers of paint thick as frosting, windows that would flood the rooms with light once I scraped away the grime. I saw potential where others saw decay, opportunity where they saw only the accumulated weight of abandoned years. The first weekend, I mapped out my plan. Start with the staircase, strip the carpet, sand the steps, work my way up through the bedrooms. The basement could wait. Dark spaces always made me uncomfortable, and I preferred to tackle projects in natural light. I set up my tools in what had been the living room, laying out sanders and brushes with the methodical precision that had served me well through 20 years of engineering. That's when I first noticed how things seemed to have their preferred positions. The folding chair I'd brought from home kept migrating to face the front window, no matter where I placed it. I'd position it near my workstation, then find it angled toward the street hours later, as if it had turned to watch something passing by. At first, I assumed I was misremembering where I'd left it, my mind distracted by measurements and material lists. The plaster dust on the fourth step bothered me more than it should have. I'd sweep it clean each morning, but by evening it had returned, not scattered randomly, but settled in the same precise outline, like a footprint made of pale powder. I began photographing it, comparing the patterns, convinced someone was accessing the house during the week. The locks were solid, though, and I found no signs of forced entry. Then came the bathroom faucet. I'd spent an entire Saturday wrestling with the old fixtures, replacing washers and tightening connections until everything gleamed chrome bright and silence sealed. But when I returned the following weekend, the handle had turned exactly 1.5 rotations, releasing a steady drip that echoed through the empty house like a metronome counting down to something I couldn't name. The sound followed me as I worked, a liquid percussion that seemed to sync with my heartbeat when I paused to listen. I'd tighten the handle, but within hours it would loosen again, always to that same precise position. I began marking it with tape, tiny flags that would confirm my growing suspicion that the house was resetting itself according to rules I didn't understand. In the basement, among boxes of forgotten belongings the previous owner had abandoned, I discovered the key to something I wasn't sure I wanted to unlock. Tucked behind the furnace, a wall hook held a handmade keychain crafted from tiny glass tiles in blues and greens, the kind of project someone might complete during long afternoons when time moved differently. Attached to it was a brooch, tarnished silver with the initials CM engraved in careful script. I held the pieces up to the basement's single bulb, watching light fracture through the glass tiles like water breaking against a pier. The craftsmanship was delicate, personal, not something mass-produced, but made by hands that knew the weight of each component, the patience required to align each tile perfectly. That night I researched the property's history, scrolling through county records and obituaries until my eyes burned from screen glare. Charlotte Meadows had lived in the house for 37 years before her death the previous spring. Widow, retired librarian, no surviving relatives. The heart attack had taken her on a Tuesday afternoon in April, her body discovered 3 days later by a concerned neighbor who'd noticed her newspapers accumulating on the front porch. I learned that she'd maintained the house exactly as her husband had left it when he passed in 1987, preserving his workshop in the basement, his reading chair positioned just so beside the living room window, even his coffee cup still sitting on the kitchen counter according to the estate sale inventory. She'd been a woman who understood the weight of continuity, the importance of keeping things in their rightful places. The knowledge should have comforted me, providing rational context for the house's quirks. Instead, it made me hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow that seemed to linger too long in my peripheral vision. When I worked on the stairs, sanding years of wear from the oak treads, I could feel a tension pressing against my shoulders like hands that stopped just short of touching. I began documenting everything obsessively, photographing each room before I left and comparing the images when I returned. The changes were subtle but consistent. Tools shifted slightly from where I'd placed them. My measuring tape wound tighter than I remembered. The folding chair always turned toward the window, as if maintaining an eternal vigil. The breakthrough came during my 5th weekend, when frustration finally overcame caution, and I decided to stop fighting the house's preferences. Instead of repositioning the chair, I left it facing the window. Instead of cleaning the plaster dust, I swept around it. Instead of tightening the faucet completely, I left it at the precise angle that seemed to satisfy whatever force governed these small rebellions. The change was immediate and unsettling. The house settled into a different kind of quiet, less resistant but more present, as if I'd finally acknowledged a conversation that had been happening around me all along. My work progressed more smoothly, but I felt constantly observed, every movement evaluated by criteria I couldn't comprehend. I found myself unconsciously adjusting my behavior to match the house's rhythms, taking breaks when the afternoon light hit the front window at exactly 3:15, avoiding the basement when clouds gathered outside, working with deliberate care that had nothing to do with craftsmanship and everything to do with maintaining some delicate balance I was only beginning to understand. The dream started during my 7th weekend. I'd wake in my apartment on weekday mornings with vivid memories of conversations I'd never had, discussions about color choices and furniture placement that felt too specific to be products of my imagination. In these dreams, I wasn't alone in the house. Someone moved through the rooms just out of sight, approving or disapproving of my decisions through adjustments that spoke louder than words. I began to suspect that my renovation wasn't just about restoring the house to its former condition, but about learning to inhabit it according to rules established by someone who had never truly left. Each weekend became a negotiation, my plans modified by feedback I received through shifted objects and subtle resistances. The most unnerving realization was how natural this felt, how easily I'd adapted to consulting invisible preferences before making changes. I caught myself pausing before moving anything, waiting for some sense of permission that came through mechanisms I couldn't identify but had learned to trust. When I finally completed the staircase, stripping away decades of carpet and paint to reveal the original wood beneath, I expected satisfaction. Instead, I felt a profound sense of completion that went beyond personal accomplishment. The house seemed to exhale, its approval radiating through walls that no longer felt like barriers between past and present. Standing at the bottom of those restored steps, running my hand along the banister that gleamed with fresh polish, I understood that I wasn't renovating this house so much as continuing a conversation that had been interrupted by death, but never truly ended. Charlotte Meadows had spent decades maintaining her husband's presence through careful preservation, and now I'd become part of that same process, not just a new owner, but a temporary custodian of something larger than property. The cord above the staircase hung perfectly still, no longer spinning when I turned off the lights. The faucet maintained its pressure without leaking. The folding chair remained where I placed it, though I'd grown comfortable leaving it facing the window, a small concession that cost me nothing and seemed to mean everything to whatever awareness still moved through these rooms. I still don't know if what I experienced was supernatural communication or the product of my own need to find meaning in the patterns of coincidence and decay. The distinction feels less important now than the understanding that some places hold their histories so completely that living there becomes a collaboration with everyone who came before. My weekend project has stretched into months, each room teaching me new lessons about the difference between renovation and restoration, between making something new and helping something remember what it once was. I've learned to read the house's preferences, to distinguish between changes it welcomes and modifications it will quietly undo while I'm away. The neighbors have started to comment on how much better the place looks, though they still cross the street when they walk past in the evenings. They remember Charlotte Meadows differently than I do, not as the meticulous caretaker I've come to know through her habits, but as the strange old woman who kept to herself and maintained her house like a shrine to the dead. Perhaps we're both right. Perhaps preservation and progress aren't always opposites, and perhaps the best renovations are the ones that honor what came before while making space for what comes next. All I know for certain is that the house on Maple Street has taught me to listen more carefully, to notice the weight that objects carry when they've been loved long enough, and to understand that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is learn to work within someone else's vision of home. The keychain still hangs on its hook in the basement, the glass tiles catching light like captured stars. I haven't moved it, and I don't think I ever will. Some things are meant to stay exactly where they are, witnesses to the continuity that connects all the hands that have worked to make this house a home. And late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I sometimes find myself planning next weekend's projects with someone else's preferences in mind, adjusting my vision to accommodate requirements I'm only beginning to understand. The house has changed me as much as I've changed it, and I'm no longer certain where the renovation ends and the conversation begins. Story 2. The first night it happened, I blamed the settling foundation. Buffalo winters are brutal on old buildings, and this place, a converted brownstone from the 1920s, had seen better decades. The floorboards between the front door and kitchen creaked like arthritic bones, a rhythmic complaint that started at exactly 3:33 a.m. and lasted maybe 30 seconds. I'd roll over in my bedroom, pull the pillow over my head, and drift back into restless sleep. But foundations don't prefer walls. Foundations don't follow patterns. By the third occurrence, I noticed the sound stayed close to the left wall, never wandering toward the center of the room. Deliberate, measured, like someone who knew this space intimately, someone who'd walked this path countless times and had learned to favor that particular route. The thought made my skin crawl, but I convinced myself it was just the way the building had warped over time. Old wood finds the path of least resistance. Then I found the chairs. 4 mismatched pieces I'd bought from a thrift store on Elmwood Avenue. A wooden captain's chair, 2 vinyl dinette seats from the 70s, and a metal folding chair I used for extra seating. I'd left them tucked neatly under my small dining table the night before, the way any rational person arranges furniture. But when I shuffled to the kitchen that morning, coffee-starved and squinting against the October sun streaming through grimy windows, they were arranged in the center of the room, not randomly scattered, but positioned with disturbing precision. A crooked square formation, all 4 seats facing the same direction toward where the front door would be if you could see through the wall. I stared at them for a full minute, my hand frozen on the coffee canister. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls had shifted inward during the night. The morning light seemed wrong too sharp, casting shadows that didn't quite align with the furniture's actual positions. My first instinct was break-in. I checked every window, every lock, every possible entry point. Nothing disturbed. No signs of forced entry. My laptop still sat on the counter, wallet untouched on the bookshelf. What kind of intruder breaks in just to rearrange furniture? I pushed the chairs back under the table and went to work, but the image stayed with me all day. That deliberate arrangement, the way they'd been angled with such careful intention, as if positioned for an audience that only existed in the space between 3:33 a.m. and dawn. The pattern repeated every other night like clockwork. The creaking journey from front door to kitchen, always hugging the left wall. Then, come morning, the chairs in their crooked square formation. After the 5th occurrence, I started paying attention to details. The captain's chair always ended up in the northwest position. The metal folding chair invariably faced slightly left of the others, as if whoever arranged them couldn't quite get the angles right but kept trying. I began leaving subtle tests. A pen placed just so on the table, a book open to a specific page, a coffee mug positioned at a precise angle. These remained undisturbed while the chairs continued their nightly migration. Whatever was happening, it had a singular focus. 3 weeks into this routine, I installed a motion-activated camera. Not video. The thought of seeing something move through my living space in the dark made my hands shake. But audio recording. I needed to know if I was losing my mind or if Buffalo's brutal isolation was finally getting to me. The first recording was worse than silence would have been. Between 3:32 and 3:34 a.m., the device captured a sound I can only describe as industrial breathing. A deep, rhythmic whoosh that reminded me of air being forced through underground tunnels, the kind of ventilation systems that move stale air through forgotten spaces. It had a mechanical quality, but underneath that mechanical rhythm was something organic, something that rose and fell with a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence. I played the recording dozens of times, adjusting the volume, filtering out background noise, trying to convince myself it was just the building's old heating system cycling on. But heating systems don't breathe. They clank and hiss and rattle, but they don't draw air in measured intervals like lungs. The research started as a distraction, something to occupy my mind during the long afternoons when I'd catch myself staring at the dining table, waiting for evening to come so I could see if the pattern would repeat. Buffalo's library system had digitized most of the city records, and finding the building's history was easier than expected. The brownstone had been built in 1923 as a single-family residence. During the Depression, it was converted to apartments. But the floor plan from the 1940s showed something that made my coffee go cold in my mouth. My kitchen had been the building's main lobby, a central room that served as a hub for all foot traffic. Residents would pass through this space to reach the stairs, check their mail, meet with visitors. The architectural drawing showed it as a perfect square, positioned exactly in the center of the ground floor's circulation pattern. A waiting room, a space where people gathered, where they sat and watched for arrivals. That night, instead of fighting the pattern, I decided to embrace it. I left the chairs exactly where they'd been positioned that morning, maintaining the crooked square formation. If something was trying to recreate a space that no longer existed, maybe accommodation would reveal more than resistance. The change was subtle but unmistakable. When I found the chairs the next morning, they'd shifted. Not dramatically, maybe 2 inches here, a slight rotation there, but enough to suggest adjustment, refinement, as if my cooperation had been noted and appreciated. Over the following weeks, I became an active participant in whatever ritual was playing out in my kitchen. I'd leave the chairs arranged each morning exactly as I'd found them, and each subsequent night brought small modifications. The captain's chair would face slightly more toward the wall. The metal folding chair would be angled inward. The vinyl seats would be pushed closer together or pulled further apart. But the direction never changed. All 4 chairs, no matter how they were adjusted, always faced toward the same invisible point, the space where visitors would have entered the old lobby, the direction from which arrival was eternally expected. I started timing the sounds more precisely. The footsteps always began at 3:33 and 17 seconds, lasting exactly 43 seconds. The breathing sound would start 3 seconds before the walking began and continue for 12 seconds after it stopped. These weren't random supernatural occurrences. They were a schedule, a routine as fixed and predictable as any commuter's morning ritual. The realization that I was sharing my space with something that operated on such rigid patterns should have been terrifying. Instead, it was almost comforting. Whatever was happening, it had rules, structure, predictability, until it didn't. The break-in pattern came on a Thursday in November. I'd fallen asleep on the couch while reading, and the sound of my phone alarm at 3:30 a.m. jarred me awake. I'd set it out of curiosity, wanting to experience the phenomena in real time rather than just through recordings and morning discoveries. The apartment was different in those pre-dawn hours. Shadows seemed deeper, more substantial. The air felt thicker, charged with the kind of atmospheric pressure that comes before storms. I sat motionless on the couch, watching the digital display on my phone count down. 3:32, 3:33. Nothing happened. No footsteps, no breathing sounds, no creaking journey from door to kitchen. The silence stretched so completely that I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears, could feel the building settling around me like a living thing, adjusting its position. At 3:34, I stood up and walked to the kitchen, phone flashlight cutting through the darkness. The chairs were gone. Not moved. Gone. The kitchen stood empty, just my small table centered in the space, no furniture around it. I swept the light across the entire room, checked the corners, looked under the table. 4 chairs had simply vanished from a locked apartment. I spent the rest of the night awake, alternating between searching every room and sitting motionless on the couch, trying to process what was happening to my sense of reality. When dawn finally came, the chairs were back, arranged in their usual formation, facing their eternal direction of expectation. But something had shifted. The arrangement was perfect now. No longer a crooked square, but a precise geometric formation with each chair positioned at exactly the right angle, the right distance, the right orientation. As if weeks of subtle adjustments had finally achieved their intended result. That morning I made a decision that felt both rational and completely insane. I would sit in one of the chairs at 3:33 a.m. and see what happened. The waiting was worse than the event itself. Every minute after midnight dragged like an hour. Every sound in the building became magnified, significant, potentially important. By 3:30, my entire body was vibrating with nervous energy and sleep deprivation. At 3:32, I positioned myself in the captain's chair, facing the same direction as all the others, toward the space where the old lobby entrance had been, toward the wall that now separated my kitchen from the building's current hallway. The breathing sound started first, just as the recordings had captured it, but experiencing it from within the formation was entirely different from hearing it through speakers. The sound wasn't coming from any particular direction. It seemed to originate from the air itself, from the space between the chairs, from the invisible center of our square. Then came the footsteps, but not on my floor. They echoed from somewhere else, somewhere that occupied the same physical space as my apartment, but existed in a different time. The sound of leather soles on polished linoleum, confident strides across a surface that hadn't existed for decades. And I understood, with the kind of clarity that comes only in moments of complete terror or complete enlightenment, that I was sitting in a waiting room that still existed, would always exist, in some fold of time that my kitchen happened to occupy. The chairs weren't being moved by a presence. They were always there, had been there since the 1940s, would be there as long as the building stood. The footsteps stopped directly in front of me, in the space where someone would have stood to address the waiting room's occupants. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel attention focused on me with the weight of decades of accumulated expectation. Then came the sound that broke whatever rationality I had left. Other chairs creaking as their occupants shifted position, as invisible visitors adjusted themselves in seats that existed alongside mine in this overlap of decades. I wasn't alone in the formation. I had never been alone. The realization drove me from the chair, sent me stumbling across the kitchen in the dark, my hands searching for the light switch while my mind tried to process what I'd experienced. When the fluorescent bulb finally flickered to life, the chairs were empty, arranged in their perfect square, facing toward nothing. But the air still held the weight of presence, of attention, of a patient gathering that had been waiting for decades, and would continue waiting long after I was gone. The lobby still existed in whatever space transcends time and renovation. The visitors still came, still took their seats, still faced toward an entrance that no longer opened onto their world, but onto mine. I haven't slept in the apartment since that night. I've been staying at a hotel downtown, paying by the day while I figure out my next move. But I can't bring myself to break the lease, can't abandon that patient gathering to their eternal wait. Because I understand now that I was never the victim of a haunting. I was invited to join something that has always been there, something that will always be there. The chairs weren't being moved for my benefit. They were being adjusted to make room for me, to help me find my proper place in a formation that has maintained its vigil since the 1940s. The question that keeps me awake in this sterile hotel room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the city's night sounds, isn't whether what I experienced was real or the product of a mind cracking under isolation and stress. The question is whether, tomorrow night, someone else will move into that apartment and discover 4 empty chairs arranged in a perfect square in their kitchen, all facing toward a wall. waiting patiently for the formation to be complete again, and whether eventually the pull of that patient gathering will become stronger than the fear of what joining it might mean. Story 3. The first thing you learn about living alone is that silence has weight. It presses against your eardrums like deep water, and in a Minneapolis loft with 15-foot ceilings and exposed brick, that silence can crush you if you're not careful. I'd been careful for 3 months, establishing routines, filling the space with familiar sounds, the coffee grinder at dawn, NPR through breakfast, the deliberate shuffle of my feet across hardwood floors that had witnessed a century of other lives. But routines, I discovered, are fragile things. The bed had always sat against the east wall, positioned to catch morning light through the industrial windows. A sensible arrangement, one that any reasonable person would maintain. Yet on that Tuesday in October, when the first snow warnings appeared on weather apps and the radiators began their seasonal percussion, I found myself moving it. Not for any practical reason. The light was fine, the space adequate. Something else drove me to drag that king-sized frame across the room, something that felt less like decision and more like compulsion. The new position faced west, toward the brick wall where shadows gathered in the afternoons like pools of dark water. I told myself it was about change, about breaking the monotony that had begun to feel like entrapment. I arranged the pillows, smoothed the comforter, and felt satisfied with the minor rebellion against my own established order. That satisfaction lasted exactly 12 hours. The first sensation came in the deep hours of pre-dawn, when Minneapolis sleeps under its blanket of early winter. I'd been drifting between sleep and consciousness, that liminal state where dreams bleed into reality, when I felt it, a gentle depression in the mattress at my feet. The give was precise, focused at ankle height, as if someone had sat down on the edge of the bed with careful consideration for my sleep. My eyes snapped open to darkness and the distant hum of heating pipes. The room was empty, of course. Moonlight filtered through the windows, casting familiar geometric patterns across the floor. Nothing had changed. Nothing had moved. Yet the sensation persisted, that unmistakable feeling of shared space, of weight distributed across springs and memory foam that had learned the shape of one body, but was now accommodating two. I lay motionless, breath shallow, listening to the building settle around me. Old buildings make noise. This was established fact. The warehouse conversion had been built in 1923, and nearly a century of thermal expansion and contraction had given it a vocabulary of creaks, sighs, and whispers that I'd learned to interpret as benign. This was different. This was the silence of someone trying not to be noticed. The depression remained for perhaps 20 minutes, maintaining its perfect consistency. Not the random settling of worn springs, but the purposeful weight of occupancy. When it finally faded, the release was so gradual, I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment of departure. 1 second I felt the presence. The next I was alone with my racing heartbeat and the absurd certainty that someone had been watching me sleep. I didn't mention it to anyone. What would I say? That my mattress was depressed? That I felt phantom weight in the darkness? These aren't the kinds of confessions you make to coworkers or include in casual phone calls home. Instead, I made mental notes, kept informal records of timing and duration. Tuesday, 3:47 a.m. to approximately 4:10 a.m. Wednesday, 3:52 a.m., lasted until I got up for water. Thursday, no occurrence, which felt almost disappointing. But Thursday night brought something else. A scent that had no business in my carefully controlled environment. I'd always been particular about smells, avoiding artificial fragrances, keeping windows cracked for fresh air circulation. The apartment carried only the odors I'd introduced. Coffee beans, the leather of my reading chair, occasionally the sage and cedar candles I lit on Sunday evenings. This was different. Richer, warmer, with the deep complexity of oil-rubbed wood and paste wax. It reminded me of antique shops and my grandfather's workshop, where hand tools hung in precise rows and everything smelled of craftsmanship and time. But I owned no such furniture, used no such products. My aesthetic ran toward clean lines and minimal maintenance, IKEA efficiency rather than heirloom character. The scent lingered through Friday night's visitation, adding olfactory weight to the physical impression. I found myself breathing deeper, trying to identify undertones, searching for rational explanations. Perhaps the previous tenant had used furniture polish, and heating system was stirring up old molecules. Perhaps the building's vintage elevator shaft was channeling odors from other units. Perhaps. The weekend brought respite and perspective. Saturday I worked late, fell asleep on the couch, and experienced nothing unusual. Sunday I stayed at a friend's place after dinner and drinks, returning to find my apartment exactly as I'd left it. Empty, quiet, normal. I began to construct reasonable explanations. Stress from the new job, seasonal adjustment disorder, too much caffeine disrupting sleep cycles. The mind, after all, was capable of elaborate self-deception. Then Monday arrived with its own revelation. I'd moved the bed back to its original position against the east wall, driven by a need to restore order to what felt increasingly chaotic. If the phenomenon was psychological, removing the trigger should eliminate the response. If it was environmental, heating ducts, settling foundation, urban vibrations, changing the bed's location would alter the manifestation's character. The logic was sound. The results were disturbing. That night, the presence migrated. I woke to find my reading chair occupied by invisible weight. The leather seat compressed in a perfect circle, darker than the surrounding material, as if someone with damp clothes had settled in for an extended stay. The impression was so precise, so clearly defined, that I photographed it with my phone, though the images revealed only what appeared to be normal wear patterns, the kind any chair might develop over years of use. But this chair was 6 months old, and I was its only occupant. The scent had followed as well, stronger now, tinged with something else I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, but unfamiliar, like old paper or fabric that had absorbed decades of careful handling. I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the compressed cushion, feeling like an intruder in my own space. The rational approach demanded investigation. Tuesday evening, I examined the chair thoroughly, running my hands along the frame, checking for structural damage or unusual wear patterns. The craftsmanship was solid, the joints tight, no obvious defects that might cause irregular settling. But when I unscrewed the base to examine the internal mechanism, something rattled loose. Coins, 3 of them, wedged between the wooden slats with the precision of deliberate placement. Not modern currency, but old pieces, silver and copper, tarnished with age, bearing dates from the 1940s and earlier. One appeared to be a mercury dime, another a wheat penny, the third something foreign I couldn't immediately identify. They felt heavy in my palm, weighted with more than their metallic composition. I researched the chair's provenance that night, calling the furniture store, tracking serial numbers, following paper trails through manufacturer databases. The chair had been made in North Carolina by a company that specialized in reproductions of classic designs, but the frame itself, the wooden structure that held the cushions, was reclaimed lumber from a workshop in Wisconsin. The original craftsman had operated from 1934 to 1978, making custom pieces for customers who valued traditional joinery over mass production. The coins, I realized, weren't foreign to the chair. They were part of its history, deliberately placed by hands that had shaped wood and understood the value of small talismans. Workshop tokens, perhaps, or simply the accumulated change that falls from pockets during long hours of careful work. I should have left them alone. Instead, I gathered them in a water glass and placed the collection on my kitchen counter, somehow convinced that removing them would break whatever connection existed between my space and its previous occupant. The chair's impression faded over the following hours, the leather returning to its original uniform color and texture. But that night, the weight returned to my mattress. Not at the foot of the bed this time, but beside me, creating a depression in the mattress that ran from shoulder to hip, the full impression of a human form seeking comfort after a day of physical labor. I could feel the slight shift in the bed's balance, the way my own body tilted almost imperceptibly toward the occupied space. The scent was overwhelming now, no longer the pleasant reminder of craftsmanship, but something more personal, more intimate, the smell of a person, not just their work. I lay rigid, afraid to move, afraid to acknowledge what couldn't possibly be real. Minutes stretched into hours, and still the presence remained, breathing space into the darkness beside me. Not threatening, exactly, but insistent in its need for recognition, for the simple courtesy of shared accommodation. When I finally found the courage to extend my arm across the mattress, my hand encountered only cool sheets and empty air. Yet the depression remained, maintaining its shape with mechanical precision, as if memory foam had learned a configuration that predated my occupancy. The next morning brought exhaustion and determination in equal measure. I packed the coins in a manila envelope and drove to the university library, seeking historical context that might explain their significance. The research took most of the day: microfilm archives, city directories, obituaries from decades past. But gradually a picture emerged. The craftsman's name was Heinrich Zimmermann, a German immigrant who'd established his workshop in Madison in 1934 after fleeing the political upheaval in his homeland. He'd been known for meticulous attention to detail, for pieces that lasted generations, for a work ethic that often kept him in his shop until well past midnight. The obituary from 1978 mentioned no surviving family, no apprentices to carry on his trade. His workshop inventory had been sold at auction, the tools and lumber scattered to various buyers throughout the Midwest, including, apparently, a furniture manufacturer in North Carolina that specialized in reclaimed materials. The coins, I discovered, were tokens from a woodworkers guild that had operated in Wisconsin during the Depression, a mutual aid society that helped craftsmen through difficult times. Members carried the tokens as proof of their skills, their commitment to quality over quantity, their understanding that some things were worth preserving regardless of economic pressure. But knowing the history didn't diminish the phenomenon. If anything, it intensified over the following nights, as if recognition had granted permission for greater intimacy. The presence no longer limited itself to bed or chair, but moved throughout the apartment with the confidence of familiarity. I would find impressions in the couch cushions, damp towels arranged with Germanic precision, the persistent scent of wood polish in rooms that contained no wooden furniture. My sleep became fragmented, interrupted not by disturbance but by awareness, the certainty that someone shared my space, someone who respected boundaries but expected acknowledgement. I began leaving small accommodations, a cup of coffee cooling on the counter, the morning newspaper folded to the craftsmanship articles, space in the closet that I somehow never filled with my own clothes. The rational mind rebelled against these concessions, insisting on psychological explanations, stress-induced hallucinations, the power of suggestion, amplified by isolation. I scheduled a checkup with my doctor, spoke vaguely about sleep disturbances and workplace anxiety, submitted to blood tests that revealed nothing abnormal. Everything pointed toward a healthy 34-year-old male experiencing a temporary adjustment disorder. Nothing that couldn't be managed with better sleep hygiene and perhaps a mild sedative. But sedatives didn't eliminate the weight beside me in the darkness. They only made me less capable of response when gentle fingers seemed to adjust my blankets with the care of someone who understood cold Minneapolis nights. The turning point came on a Thursday in November, when early snow transformed the city into something resembling a Christmas card. I'd been living with my invisible roommate for nearly a month, growing accustomed to the rhythm of shared solitude, when I discovered that accommodation was a two-way street. My morning coffee was perfectly prepared when I entered the kitchen, not just hot, but precisely the temperature I preferred, with the exact ratio of cream that usually took me 3 attempts to achieve. The newspaper was folded to an article about furniture restoration, a pen lying beside it as if someone had been taking notes. And there, arranged on the counter beside the water glass of coins, was a small wooden figure, a craftsman in miniature, carved with the kind of detail that spoke of intimate familiarity with human form and gesture. I hadn't placed it there. I owned nothing like it. Yet it felt familiar, as if it had always belonged in that exact spot, as if the apartment had finally found its proper configuration. That night, I spoke aloud to the darkness for the first time. "I know you're here," I said, feeling foolish and frightened and strangely comforted all at once. "I don't understand what you want, but you're welcome to stay." The response was immediate, a settling sensation throughout the room. as if tension I hadn't recognized was finally released. The mattress depressed beside me with what felt like gratitude, and the scent of wood polish carried undertones of satisfaction, of work completed to exacting standards. I slept better that night than I had in weeks, but understanding brought its own complications. Friends began to comment on my distraction, my tendency to pause mid-conversation as if listening to voices they couldn't hear. Coworkers noticed my habit of leaving space at restaurant tables, of ordering 2 coffees when meeting for business discussions. I found myself explaining that I was expecting someone, that I had a guest arriving, that I needed to account for additional requirements. The lies came easily, but they were lies nonetheless. More disturbing was my growing reluctance to leave the apartment for extended periods, not because I felt trapped, but because absence felt like abandonment. I would return from weekend trips to find subtle rearrangements. Books moved to different shelves, furniture repositioned with mathematical precision, improvements that I couldn't deny were improvements but which I certainly hadn't authorized. The carved figure multiplied, joined by others that appeared during my absence. A woman holding a child, worn smooth by decades of handling. An elderly man with tools in his belt, his face marked by patience and care. A family group arranged around a dinner table, each expression capturing some essential moment of domestic contentment. They were beautiful. They were inexplicable. They were slowly filling every surface in my apartment with the weight of lives I'd never lived. By December, I could no longer pretend that my situation was temporary or psychological. The presence had become integral to my daily routine, as essential as heat or electricity. I found myself consulting with invisible counsel before making decisions, seeking approval for changes to our shared space, negotiating compromises between my preferences and needs I couldn't fully understand. The coins remained in their water glass, but their significance had expanded beyond simple historical curiosity. They were a contract, I realized, binding me to obligations I'd accepted without fully comprehending their scope. Removing them might restore my solitude, but it would also constitute a betrayal of trust that had been carefully built over months of patient coexistence. Yet keeping them meant accepting a reality that existed outside conventional understanding, admitting that my carefully controlled life had been invaded by forces that operated according to different rules entirely. It meant acknowledging that I was no longer alone, might never be alone again, and that this arrangement suited me more than solitude ever had. The question wasn't whether I was losing my mind. That ship had sailed weeks ago, taking my certainties about reality with it. The question was whether madness, if that's what this was, represented loss or liberation. On Christmas Eve, I found my answer. I'd been working late, fighting deadline pressure and seasonal depression, when I returned to discover that the apartment had been decorated, not with anything I would have chosen. No blinking lights or artificial trees or mass-produced ornaments. Instead, the space had been transformed with the kind of craftsmanship that required patience and skill. Hand-carved angels hanging from invisible threads, wreaths woven from materials I couldn't identify, centerpieces that seemed to glow with their own inner light. And there, beside my chair, sat a wrapped package, small, precise, tied with ribbon that looked like it had been saved from celebrations decades past. Inside was a set of woodworking tools, antique pieces maintained in perfect condition, their handles worn smooth by use. A note, written in careful script, explained their provenance. These belonged to my father, then to me, then to the shop that sold your chair. They should be used, not displayed. A craft dies when it stops moving through human hands. I held them for hours, feeling their balance, understanding intuitively how each tool would respond to pressure, how wood would react to their carefully maintained edges. I had no training in carpentry, no experience with handcraft beyond basic home maintenance. Yet something in their weight felt familiar, as if my hands remembered skills I'd never learned. That night, I dreamed of workshops filled with sawdust and purpose, of projects that took months to complete and lifetimes to master. I dreamed of a tradition that passed between generations, not through blood but through dedication, not through inheritance but through recognition of value worth preserving. When I woke, the tools were still in my hands, and the presence beside me felt less like visitation than partnership. I've been learning to carve. Simple projects at first. Functional items that fill gaps in my daily routine. But already I can feel the progression, the way raw materials respond to patient attention, the satisfaction of creating something that will outlast its maker. The apartment fills slowly with my amateur attempts, crude but improving, each piece marking progress toward mastery I may never achieve, but which I'm committed to pursuing. The presence approves. I can feel its satisfaction when I work late into the evening, pushing toward standards that exist outside my natural inclinations. It guides my hands when I'm uncertain, corrects mistakes before they become failures, teaches through demonstration rather than criticism. I no longer question whether this is real or imaginary. The distinction has become irrelevant. What matters is the work, the continuity, the understanding that some things are worth preserving regardless of their inability to fit conventional explanations. Sometimes, late at night when the tools are clean and properly stored, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Hands that continue work I've begun. Figures that move through my space with the confidence of long residence. They don't frighten me anymore. If anything, they comfort me with the certainty that I'm not alone in valuing craftsmanship over convenience, tradition over innovation. The coins remain in their glass, no longer curiosities but symbols of a guild I've joined without formal initiation, obligations I've accepted without completely understanding their scope. They remind me daily that some habits are worth maintaining, some traditions worth continuing, regardless of how the world changes around them. And if that makes me crazy, then madness is a small price to pay for the kind of purpose I've found in shared solitude, in work that matters, in the patient satisfaction of creating things built to last. The bed still shifts beside me in the darkness, but now it feels like companionship rather than intrusion. We are craftsmen, after all, working different materials toward the same end, the preservation of something valuable in a world increasingly indifferent to permanence. In the morning, I will return to my tools, to projects that require more skill than I currently possess, but which I'm slowly learning to complete. The work continues, passes from hand to hand, maintains itself through dedication rather than documentation. And in the space between sleeping and waking, between rational and impossible, I am no longer alone with the weight of that continuation. Story 4. The first time it happened, I thought the building was settling. My studio in Tacoma had always been quiet after midnight, just the occasional whisper of traffic on Pacific Avenue and the distant hum of the space heater. I'd chosen this place specifically for the silence, needing somewhere I could work on my sound engineering projects without the urban noise bleeding through. The converted warehouse had thick walls, high ceilings, and a ventilation system that ran so quietly I often forgot it existed. Until 2:12 a.m. on a Tuesday in November. I was hunched over my mixing board, fine-tuning the levels on a podcast episode, when a low rumble emerged from somewhere above me. Not the mechanical wheeze of old ductwork, or the predictable groan of expanding metal. This was something else entirely. A sustained note that seemed to originate from deep within the building's skeleton, vibrating through the floor and up through my chest cavity. The frequency was so low it bypassed my ears almost completely, registering instead as a pressure that made my ribs ache. The lampshade on my desk lamp trembled. Just slightly, like someone had brushed against the table, though I hadn't moved. The cap of a marker rolled an inch across my work surface before stopping abruptly. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound ceased. I sat in the restored silence, heart hammering against that same frequency's resonance point. My first instinct was to blame the building's ancient HVAC system. Maybe a motor bearing had finally given out, or debris had gotten caught in the main intake. But when I checked the time on my computer, the numbers seemed to pulse. 2:12 a.m. The next night, I waited. I told myself it was professional curiosity. As an audio engineer, I couldn't ignore an interesting acoustic phenomenon, especially one that seemed to have such a specific temporal pattern. I set up a basic recording rig pointed toward the ceiling vent and forced myself to stay awake past 2 a.m., coffee cooling beside my keyboard. At 2:12 exactly, the rumble returned. This time, I was ready for it. I watched the audio levels spike on my interface, watched the needle on my analog VU meter dance in the red. But what disturbed me wasn't just the sound itself. It was the way it seemed to call forth responses from the objects around me. The lampshade didn't just vibrate, it swayed in a deliberate rhythm, as if keeping time with some inaudible beat. The loose papers on my desk fluttered in sequence, one after another, like dominoes made of office supplies. When I played back the recording the next morning, I heard something I hadn't noticed in real time. Gaps, clean cuts in the audio, as if someone had taken scissors to the waveform. The rumble would build to a certain intensity, then vanish for exactly 3 seconds before resuming. The pattern reminded me of something, breathing maybe, or the measured exhalation through metal grating. By the third occurrence, I was taking notes. Duration, approximately 47 seconds. Frequency range, estimated 30-40 Hz, well below most people's conscious hearing threshold. Response pattern, small objects react first, larger ones following in order of increasing mass. The floor lamp in the corner seemed particularly sensitive, its metal base conducting the vibration up through the pole until the entire fixture swayed like a metronome. On the fourth night, the lamp fell over. I watched it happen in what felt like slow motion. The base lifting slightly off the carpet, the weighted bottom tilting past its center of gravity, the shade rotating as it toppled. But instead of crashing down, it settled gently onto the rug, the fabric shade coming to rest against the floor without even wrinkling. No broken bulb, no damaged fixture, as if the fall had been choreographed. That's when I started leaving the measuring tape extended. It wasn't a conscious decision at first. I'd been using the tape to map out the room's dimensions, trying to identify any acoustic dead zones that might explain the phenomenon. The bright yellow tape stretched from the ventilation grate to the far wall, 23 feet of rigid metal and plastic extending across my workspace like a taut string. The first time the sound occurred with the tape in place, I noticed the difference immediately. The rumble was clearer, more focused. Instead of the diffuse pressure I'd grown accustomed to, the frequency seemed to follow the path of the measuring tape, traveling along its length like a signal through a wire. The objects that had been responding randomly now moved in a clear progression, starting near the vent and rippling outward along the tape's trajectory. I experimented. One night I left the tape retracted, coiled in its plastic housing. The sound came as scheduled, but weaker, more scattered. The next night I stretched it only halfway across the room. The frequency followed the tape's reach exactly, fading to nothing at its endpoint. By the second week, I was convinced the tape served as some kind of antenna. The idea should have terrified me. Instead, I found myself looking forward to 2:12 a.m. with an anticipation that felt uncomfortably close to hunger. I began making preparations, clearing the tape's path, positioning objects at regular intervals to better observe the phenomenon, even adjusting my sleep schedule to ensure I'd be alert during the event. My work suffered. The podcast clients whose deadlines had once been sacred were now afterthoughts, their phone calls going unanswered while I researched acoustic resonance theory and subsonic communication patterns. I ordered specialized equipment, infrasonic microphones, vibration sensors, spectrum analyzers that could map frequencies below human perception. The packages arrived in brown boxes that I stacked in corners, too excited about the evening's observation session to properly unpack them. The measuring tape became a fixture in my studio, its yellow length bisecting the room like a horizon line. I found myself adjusting its position obsessively, ensuring it remained perfectly straight, verifying that both ends were properly secured, sometimes crawling along its length to check for kinks or obstructions. The ritual felt necessary, though I couldn't have explained why. 3 weeks after the first incident, I realized I wasn't sleeping. Not during daylight hours anyway. I'd collapse into my desk chair around 3 a.m. after the frequency had faded and my notes were complete, and drift off until noon. Then I'd spend the day in a fog of caffeine and anticipation, counting hours until the next occurrence. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to bulge slightly, as if the internal pressure had pushed them outward. But the real changes were subtler. I found myself walking along straight lines, the edge of sidewalks, the painted lanes in parking lots, the seam where the hardwood flooring met the carpeted area of my studio. My movements had developed a rhythm that matched some half-remembered cadence, a measured pace that felt both foreign and familiar. One morning I woke to find I'd drawn diagrams in my sleep. They covered 3 pages of my notebook, precise geometric patterns that looked like architectural blueprints crossed with musical notation. Straight lines connected nodes that were labeled with frequencies, distances, and times. In the margin, written in my own handwriting but in script I didn't remember forming, were calculations involving wavelength and resonance. At the bottom of the final page, a single word: calibrated. I stared at the diagrams until my vision blurred, trying to recall the moment of their creation. The paper showed signs of pressure, deep grooves where I'd pressed too hard with the pencil, smudges where my hand had dragged across fresh marks. But the memory remained blank, as if those hours had been carefully excised from my consciousness. That night, I set up a camera. The digital recorder sat on a tripod pointed toward the measuring tape, its infrared sensors capable of capturing movement even in complete darkness. I positioned myself in its field of view and waited for 2:12 a.m., pulse quickening as the minutes ticked away. The frequency arrived on schedule, but this time something was different. As the rumble built to its familiar intensity, I felt a corresponding resonance in my chest cavity. Not just the passive vibration I'd experienced before, but something that seemed to originate from within. My breath synchronized with the sound's rhythm, inhaling during the 3-second gaps, exhaling as the tone resumed. The measuring tape didn't just conduct the frequency, it pulsed with a faint phosphorescence that my naked eye hadn't detected. Through the camera's night vision, I watched waves of light travel along its length, starting at the vent and flowing outward like electrical current through a conductor. Where the light touched objects, they responded, not randomly, but in perfect sequence, each movement timed to millisecond precision. And in the center of it all, barely visible in the recording's green-tinted display, I saw myself. Standing perfectly still, arms at my sides, staring upward at the ventilation grate with an expression of complete focus. My lips were moving, though no sound emerged. The shape of the words looked familiar, but I couldn't quite make them out through the camera's limited resolution. When the frequency faded, I remained motionless for several more minutes before finally returning to my chair. But according to the timestamp, I'd been standing for over an hour, 43 minutes longer than the sound had lasted. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to watch the recording again. The memory of viewing it felt dreamlike, uncertain. Had I really seen myself standing in that trance-like state? Had the measuring tape actually glowed, or was that an artifact of the night vision technology? The files sat on my computer desktop, their icons pulsing with each cursor movement, but every time I moved to open them, my hand found reasons to click elsewhere. Instead, I focused on the equipment I'd ordered. The infrasonic microphones revealed that the frequency was more complex than I'd initially thought. Not a single tone, but a series of harmonics that created interference patterns throughout the room. The vibration sensors showed that the disturbance extended beyond my studio, creating sympathetic resonances in the floors above and below. Most disturbing of all, the spectrum analyzer indicated that the frequency had been growing stronger. Each night, the amplitude increased by a measurable percentage. What had begun as a barely perceptible rumble was evolving into something more substantial, more present. I charted the progression on graph paper, the ascending line looking uncomfortably like a heartbeat monitor. If the pattern continued, the frequency would reach levels that could cause structural damage within a matter of weeks. But somehow I doubted it would take that long to reach its intended intensity. 2 nights later, I woke up outside. I found myself in the parking lot behind my building, wearing only a t-shirt and boxer shorts, the asphalt cold against my bare feet. The digital clock on a nearby bank sign read 3:47 a.m. I had no memory of leaving my studio, no recollection of the hour and a half between the frequency's end and this moment of confused awakening. Back in my studio, the measuring tape was gone, not retracted into its housing, completely absent. I searched every corner, every drawer, every possible hiding place. The specialized equipment I'd set up to monitor the phenomenon had been carefully packed back into their shipping boxes, which were stacked neatly by the door. My notebooks were missing too, along with any digital files related to my observations. The only evidence that remained was a faint residue on the carpet where the tape had rested, a straight line of compressed fibers that caught the light differently than the surrounding material. I knelt and ran my fingers along the mark, feeling a subtle warmth that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. That night, 2:12 a.m. came and went in perfect silence. The absence of the frequency felt more unsettling than its presence had been. I sat in my chair, straining to hear even the faintest rumble from the ventilation system, but the building remained stubbornly quiet. The silence pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight, creating phantom sounds that dissolved the moment I tried to focus on them. By 3 a.m., I was pacing the studio, following the compressed line in the carpet with obsessive precision. My feet found the path automatically, maintaining perfect alignment with the residue mark. The motion felt necessary, vital, as if breaking the pattern might have consequences I wasn't prepared to face. Days passed without the frequency returning. I tried to resume my normal work, but the podcast episodes I mixed sounded hollow and wrong, as if some essential component had been filtered out. Clients complained that their voices lacked presence, that the audio felt somehow incomplete. One described it as listening to recordings made in a vacuum. I began shopping for measuring tapes. The impulse felt rational at first. I needed to replace the equipment that had mysteriously vanished. But as I stood in the hardware store's tool aisle, comparing different models and lengths, I realized I was looking for something specific. The yellow Stanley tape I'd originally used had been 25 feet long, with a stiff, wide blade that held its extension well. Finding an exact replacement became an obsession that sent me to 3 different stores across Tacoma. When I finally found the right model, my hands trembled as I carried it to the checkout counter. The cashier, a tired-looking woman with paint-stained fingers, studied my face with obvious concern. "You feeling all right?" she asked as she scanned the barcode. "You look like you haven't slept in days." I tried to respond, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I nodded and paid in cash, clutching the receipt like a talisman as I hurried back to my car. That evening, I stretched the new tape across my studio floor, measuring the distance 3 times to ensure it matched the residue line exactly. The metal blade gleamed under the overhead lights, its yellow surface unmarked by use. I positioned it carefully, checking the alignment from multiple angles until I was satisfied with its placement. At 2:12 a.m., the frequency returned, but this time, I was ready. The rumble emerged from the ventilation grate with greater intensity than ever before, but instead of the scattered chaos I'd initially experienced, the sound followed the measuring tape with laser precision. Objects along its path responded in perfect sequence, their movements creating a visual representation of the frequency's progress across the room. And this time, I didn't just observe. As the tone reached its peak, I found myself walking along the tape's length, my bare feet stepping in precise rhythm with the sound's pulses. Each step seemed to amplify the frequency, creating feedback loops that made the entire building hum with sympathetic vibration. I could feel the presence now, not just as sound or vibration, but as an awareness that filled the space around me. It was patient, methodical, and utterly alien in its thought patterns. The measuring tape wasn't just an antenna. It was a tuning fork, a calibration tool that allowed something vast and incomprehensible to focus its attention on a single point in space. As I reached the tape's end, 25 feet from the ventilation grate, I understood what it wanted. The frequency wasn't random or meaningless. It was a signal, a call for precise measurement and alignment. Something was trying to establish a connection, to create a pathway between its realm and mine. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a profound sense of completion, as if I'd finally found the missing piece of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving. The next morning, I bought a second measuring tape, then a third. By the end of the week, yellow lines crisscrossed my studio like a geometric web, each one perfectly aligned with mathematical precision I didn't remember calculating. The measuring tapes formed angles and intersections that created standing wave patterns, acoustic focal points where the frequency could gather and intensify. Each night at 2:12 a.m., I walked the patterns, my footsteps keeping time with sounds that grew stronger and more complex. The presence I felt during those sessions became more distinct, more individual. I began to understand its preferences, the specific angles it favored, the resonant frequencies that allowed it to project more of itself into my space. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed changes I couldn't ignore. My eyes had developed a slight phosphorescent quality, particularly visible in low light. My hearing had become acutely sensitive to subsonic frequencies, allowing me to detect the presence's approach minutes before 2:12 a.m. arrived. But the most significant change was in my sleep patterns, or rather, their absence. I no longer lost consciousness during the day. Instead, I entered a state of heightened awareness that lasted from sunrise to sunset, my mind processing information with crystalline clarity. The boundary between waking and dreaming had dissolved, replaced by a continuous stream of consciousness that felt both familiar and utterly transformed. Tonight, as I write this, 23 measuring tapes stretch across my studio in patterns that would have seemed impossible a month ago. The phosphorescent residue they've left on the carpet creates a mandala of intersecting lines, each one pulsing faintly with its own rhythm. In 17 minutes, the frequency will return, and this time, I think it's bringing friends. The ventilation grate above my head has begun to emit a faint glow, barely visible but growing stronger by the hour. The sound equipment I'd packed away has mysteriously returned, positioned at precise intervals along the measuring tape grid. My notebooks have reappeared as well, but their pages now contain calculations in handwriting that resembles mine, but flows with inhuman precision. I no longer question whether this experience is real or imagined. The distinction has become irrelevant. What matters is the growing certainty that I'm participating in something far larger than my understanding. A process of measurement and calibration that extends beyond my studio, beyond Tacoma, beyond the limits of human perception. The measuring tapes pulse in unison now, their yellow surfaces rippling with waves of light that originate from no identifiable source. When I walk their patterns, I feel myself becoming part of a vast instrument, a component in a mechanism designed to bridge impossible distances. In 12 minutes, the frequency will call, and I will answer. Because I finally understand what it's been measuring all along, not the dimensions of my studio, me. Story 5. The photo shouldn't have shown anything. I'd taken it as a joke, really, standing on the porch of my buddy's hunting cabin 15 steps from that ancient outhouse, the kind of ramshackle structure that looked like it had been there since the Roosevelt administration. The first Roosevelt. I'd barely cracked the door an inch, just enough to aim my phone into the absolute darkness between those towering pines that surrounded us like silent sentinels. The joke was supposed to be the black screen I'd send to our group chat, maybe with some caption about the glamorous accommodations up here in northern Maine. But the flash hadn't fired. I was sure of that. The screen had stayed dark, that familiar camera interface glowing in my palm, without so much as a flicker of light to disturb the thick darkness beyond the porch's yellow bug light. Yet when I looked at what the camera had captured, my stomach did a slow, uncomfortable roll. Two shapes clung to the frame's edges like they'd been painted there in different shades of night. One pale blur that seemed almost luminous against the black. Another so dark it appeared to absorb what little ambient light the camera had somehow managed to detect. They weren't random artifacts or dust on the lens. These had definition, substance. The pale one reminded me of a face turned away, while the dark mass looked like someone hunched and waiting. I sent it anyway, adding a caption about the 5-star bathroom facilities. Within minutes, my friend's voice carried through the thin cabin walls from his bedroom, casual and unconcerned, confirming what I already knew but hadn't wanted to think about. Nobody had left the cabin. We were alone up here, just the two of us in 30 square miles of unbroken forest. Sleep came in fragments that night. Every creak of the old logs settling, every whisper of wind through pine needles, every distant crack of a branch somewhere in the darkness beyond our windows pulled me back to consciousness. The cabin felt smaller than it had during daylight, its walls pressing closer with each hour that passed. I found myself listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. Footsteps on the porch, breathing outside the windows, the soft rustle of fabric moving through the underbrush. When dawn finally leaked through the gaps in the curtains, I was already dressed. The morning air bit at my face as I stepped onto the porch, coffee mug steaming in my hands. Everything looked different in daylight, smaller, more ordinary. The outhouse was just a weathered wooden box with a crescent moon carved into the door. The pine trees, so imposing in the darkness, now stood like ordinary forest guardians, their branches heavy with dew that caught the early sunlight like scattered diamonds. I told myself I was being ridiculous as I walked those 15 steps again, phone in hand. Whatever the camera had picked up the night before was surely just some trick of shadow and light, the kind of pareidolia that makes us see faces in clouds and figures in wallpaper patterns. But I had to know. This time I opened the outhouse door wider, held the phone up, and deliberately triggered the flash. The burst of white light was harsh and sudden, turning the forest around me into a photographic negative for one brilliant instant before plunging everything back into natural morning shadows. I lowered the phone and looked at what I'd captured. The dark shape was there again, but now it was lower, crouched, as if it had been standing the night before, and was now kneeling or squatting near the base of a massive pine. The pale blur had vanished, but the dark mass remained, and in the sharp definition provided by the flash, I could make out details that made my hands shake. It looked like someone wrapped in fabric, hunched and motionless among the trees. I walked toward the spot, my feet crunching through dried pine needles and fallen leaves. When I reached the base of the tree where the shape had appeared, there was nothing. No depression in the earth, no disturbance of the forest floor, no sign that anyone or anything had ever been there. I crouched down, running my fingers through the needle carpet, searching for some evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. Nothing. But as I stood, brushing dirt from my hands, I caught a scent that didn't belong to the forest. Old wool, musty and thick, the kind of smell that comes from clothes stored too long in damp places. It was gone almost as quickly as I'd noticed it, replaced again by the clean pine and earth smell of the Maine woods. I spent the rest of the morning trying to convince myself that what I was experiencing was explainable. Old cameras sometimes double-exposed frames. Digital sensors could malfunction. The human brain was notorious for filling in gaps with patterns and meaning where none existed. I'd read about this stuff, how easily the mind could be tricked, especially in unfamiliar environments where every stimulus felt heightened. But when my friends suggested we drive into town for supplies, I found myself making excuses to stay behind. The idea of leaving the cabin, of turning my back on whatever was or wasn't lurking in those woods, filled me with an anxiety I couldn't explain or shake. He left around noon, promising to bring back steaks and beer, joking about how city living had made me soft. I watched his truck disappear down the rutted dirt road, its engine noise fading until only forest sounds remained. The silence that followed felt expectant, as if the woods were holding their breath. I tried to distract myself with normal activities, reading, checking email on the spotty cell signal, organizing the fishing gear we'd brought. But my eyes kept drifting to the windows, and every shadow that moved across the glass made my pulse quicken. The afternoon stretched endlessly, each hour marked only by the slow progression of sunlight across the cabin floor. Around 4 o'clock, I decided to print the photos. The cabin had an old inkjet printer, the kind that wheezed and complained with every page, but still functioned after years of hunting season service. I'd brought photo paper specifically for this, matte finish, the kind that brought out subtle details and textures that glossy paper sometimes missed. The first photo, the one from the night before, printed normally. The shapes were there, pale and dark, clinging to the edges like shy spirits avoiding the camera's attention. But when I held it up to the window light, I could see something I'd missed on the phone screen. The dark shape had texture. It wasn't just a blur or a shadow artifact. In the matte paper's surface, I could make out a distinct pattern. Small squares, regular and uniform, like the weave of old fabric. It looked exactly like the pattern you'd find on a heavy wool coat, the kind loggers and hunters wore decades ago when this cabin was first built. The second photo was worse. The crouched figure was clearer now, and the fabric pattern was unmistakable. But there was something else, something that made my throat go dry and my hands tremble as I held the print. At what might have been the top of the hunched shape, partially obscured by shadow and grain, was a pale oval that could have been a face turned downward, as if whoever wore that old coat was looking at the ground in shame or despair. I set the photos on the kitchen table and backed away from them, my heart hammering against my ribs. The rational part of my mind insisted this was all projection, pattern-seeking behavior run amok. But the primitive part, the part that had kept my ancestors alive when the world was full of things that hunted in the darkness, was screaming warnings I couldn't ignore. The sun was setting when I heard the first sound that didn't belong. It was soft, almost inaudible beneath the evening chorus of insects and settling wood, the whisper of fabric moving against fabric. I froze, every muscle in my body suddenly taut, straining to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the very air around the cabin was rustling with invisible movement. Then it stopped. I stood motionless for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, waiting for the sound to repeat or reveal itself as something innocent. Wind in the trees, an animal moving through the underbrush, the cabin's old timbers responding to temperature changes. But the silence that followed was different from before, charged with potential energy like the moment before lightning strikes. When I finally moved, walking carefully to the front window and peering out through the curtains, the woods looked empty. The spaces between the trees, so clearly defined in daylight, had become pools of shadow that could hide anything. The outhouse stood 15 steps away, its door hanging slightly ajar in a way I didn't remember leaving it. Had I left it open? I tried to recall my morning visit, but the details seemed frustratingly vague, as if my memory was being deliberately obscured. The rustling sound came again, closer this time, and definitely from outside. It moved around the cabin's perimeter with deliberate slowness, as if something was circling the building just beyond the reach of the porch light. I followed the sound with my eyes, tracking it from window to window, but never caught a glimpse of what might be making it. When my friend's truck finally rumbled back up the driveway, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness, I nearly collapsed with relief. I hadn't realized how tense I'd become, how tightly wound every nerve had grown during the long afternoon of waiting and watching. He came through the door carrying grocery bags and talking about the drive, about the old-timer at the general store who'd recognized the cabin and started telling stories about its previous owner. But his voice seemed to come from very far away, and I found it difficult to focus on his words. All my attention was drawn to the windows, to the darkness beyond the glass, to the feeling that we were being observed by something that had been waiting patiently for us to lower our guard. During dinner, I showed him the printed photos. He studied them for a long time, turning them toward the light, squinting at the details I'd been obsessing over all day. Finally, he handed them back with a shrug and an explanation about pareidolia, camera artifacts, and the tricks our brains play when we're looking for patterns that aren't there. Everything I'd been telling myself, delivered with the confidence of someone who hadn't been alone in these woods for 6 hours, feeling eyes on him from every shadow. But I noticed he kept glancing toward the windows while we ate. That night I lay awake again, listening. The rustling sound had returned, circling the cabin with mechanical persistence. Sometimes it would pause directly outside my window, and I would hold my breath, waiting for some other sign of presence. A tap on the glass, a whispered word, the scrape of fingers against weathered wood. But it would always resume its patient patrol, moving with a rhythm that suggested familiarity with the terrain, as if whatever was out there had been walking this same path for years. Around 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and crept to the kitchen for water. The printed photos were still on the table where I'd left them, but in the dim light from the stove's digital clock, they looked different. The fabric pattern in the dark shape seemed more pronounced, the weave more clearly defined, and the pale oval that might have been a face appeared to have shifted slightly, as if the head had lifted just enough to reveal the suggestion of features. I told myself it was just the lighting, just my tired eyes playing tricks. But as I stood there in the dark kitchen, staring at those photos, I became convinced that something was staring back. The next morning brought no relief. If anything, the daylight made everything worse by revealing how normal everything looked, how peaceful the forest appeared, how innocent the outhouse seemed, how perfectly explainable every shadow and sound should have been. The disconnect between what I was experiencing and what I was seeing created a cognitive dissonance that left me feeling unmoored from reality. I took more photos. I couldn't help myself. Every hour or so, I would walk those 15 steps and point my camera at the woods, sometimes with flash, sometimes without. The results varied, but the dark shape with its distinctive fabric pattern appeared in roughly half of them, always in slightly different positions, always suggesting movement and purpose. By the third day, I had dozens of photos spread across the kitchen table like evidence in some impossible case. The progression was clear to anyone willing to look. The shape was getting closer to the cabin, moving from deep in the woods toward the building with each passing day. In the most recent photos, taken that morning, it appeared to be standing just beyond the tree line, close enough that I should have been able to see it with my naked eye when I looked out the window. But there was never anything there. My friend had started giving me concerned looks, asking if I was feeling all right, suggesting we cut the trip short and head back to civilization. I could see the worry in his eyes, the way he was starting to treat me like someone who needed careful handling. And maybe he was right. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Maybe the unfamiliar environment was triggering some kind of breakdown. But that didn't explain the photos. On the fourth night, I decided to wait outside. I set up a chair on the porch after my friend had gone to bed, wrapped myself in a blanket, and prepared to keep watch until dawn. If something was circling the cabin, if something was moving through those woods with the deliberate purpose the photos suggested, I was going to see it with my own eyes. The night was cloudless and cold, with enough starlight to give definition to the trees and shadows. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, every sense extended into the darkness around me. The familiar sounds of the forest, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional owl call, provided a backdrop against which any foreign sound would stand out clearly. Around midnight, I heard it. The rustling was unmistakable now, and much closer than it had ever been before. It moved along the edge of the tree line, following the same circular path I'd been tracking for days, but now I could hear additional details: the soft brush of fabric against bark, the almost inaudible whisper of footsteps on pine needles, the careful, measured breathing of something that didn't want to be heard. I sat frozen, afraid that any movement would alert whatever was out there to my presence. The sounds grew closer, moving along the perimeter until they were directly in front of the cabin, perhaps 20 feet from where I sat. I strained my eyes, searching the shadows for any sign of movement, any shape that didn't belong to the natural landscape. And then I saw it. Just for a moment, at the very edge of my vision, something moved between two large pines. It was darker than the surrounding shadows, with a hunched human shape wrapped in fabric that caught what little starlight penetrated the forest canopy. The pattern was there. The same distinctive weave I'd been seeing in the photos, now visible to my naked eye as a texture that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The figure paused, as if sensing my gaze, and what might have been its head turned in my direction. For one terrible moment, I thought I saw the pale suggestion of a face beneath the fabric's shadow. Features blurred by distance and darkness, but unmistakably human in their basic arrangement. Then it was gone, melting back into the forest with a silence that suggested supernatural rather than natural movement. I sat on that porch until dawn, but I never saw it again. When my friend woke and found me there, pale and shaking in the morning light, I tried to explain what I'd witnessed, but the words sounded hollow even to my own ears, and I could see the growing alarm in his expression as I described the figure in the woods, the fabric pattern, the sense of being watched and cataloged by something that had no business existing. He insisted we pack up and leave that morning. I didn't argue. The photos were evidence enough for me, even if they convinced no one else. I gathered them carefully, stacking them in order of capture, creating a timeline of approach that documented something I still couldn't fully understand or accept. But as we loaded the truck and prepared to leave that place behind, I found myself looking back at the woods with a mixture of terror and terrible curiosity. Whatever I'd encountered in those photos, whatever had been circling the cabin in the darkness, felt unfinished, like a conversation that had been interrupted, a question that remained unanswered. The drive back to civilization passed in uncomfortable silence, my friend occasionally glancing at me with the worried expression of someone watching a loved one slip away from reality. And maybe that's exactly what was happening. Maybe the isolation and unfamiliar environment had triggered something in my brain, some dormant tendency toward paranoia and pattern seeking that had manifested as supernatural encounters. But I still have the photos. They sit in a manila folder in my desk drawer, 47 images that document something impossible. Sometimes late at night when sleep won't come, I take them out and study them under a bright desk lamp, searching for some detail I might have missed, some clue that would make everything make sense. The fabric pattern is always there, clear and distinct in the matte paper's surface, and in the later photos, the ones taken closest to our departure, I can make out additional details. The suggestion of hands hanging at the figure's sides, the way the fabric drapes over what might be shoulders, the persistent sense that whatever wore that ancient coat was looking directly at the camera with an intelligence that transcended the mechanical process of image capture. I've never returned to the cabin, despite my friend's occasional suggestions that we plan another hunting trip. The idea of those woods, of that 15-step walk to the outhouse, of that circle of darkness beyond the porch light, fills me with a dread I can't rationally explain or dismiss. But sometimes, in my own suburban neighborhood, surrounded by streetlights and the comfortable sounds of modern life, I catch a scent on the evening air that doesn't belong. Old wool, musty and thick. The smell of clothes stored too long in damp places. And in those moments, I find myself checking the shadows between houses, looking for patterns that shouldn't be there, listening for the soft rustle of fabric moving through darkness. The photos remain my only proof that those 4 days in the Maine woods were more than just a psychological episode brought on by isolation and unfamiliar surroundings. But proof of what exactly? That's the question that haunts me now. The uncertainty that has made every shadow a potential threat and every unexplained sound a possible reminder that some encounters don't end simply because we choose to walk away from them. I've learned to live with not knowing, but I've never learned to forget the feeling of being watched by something that existed in the spaces between certainty and madness, between the photographable world and the realm of things that shouldn't be captured on film but somehow are. The pattern in the dark remains, woven into matte paper and memory, a textile ghost that refuses to fade. Story 6. The board shouldn't have worked. That's what I keep telling myself as I stare through this glass wall at the canal below, watching the afternoon light fracture across the surface like broken promises. 2 weeks ago, I was laughing about it with the others at O'Malley's, that cramped happy hour spot above the old tobacco warehouse in downtown Richmond. Someone had dragged up an antique Ouija board from the basement storage, probably left behind by some previous tenant who'd given up on whatever dreams had brought them there. The thing looked ancient, warped plywood with faded letters that seemed to shift in the dim bar lighting. The planchette was smooth from decades of nervous fingers, worn down to the wood grain. We'd been drinking since 5, celebrating another quarterly report that meant nothing to anyone except the executives who'd never set foot in our department. After the others filtered out to catch their rides home, I found myself alone with that ridiculous board, bourbon making everything seem profound and terrible at once. The question had been eating at me for weeks, whether to accept the transfer offer that had been sitting in my email like a ticking bomb. Different department, different building, different everything. A chance to start fresh, or a chance to fail spectacularly in a new environment. My fingers found the planchette almost involuntarily. The wood was warm, as if someone else had just been using it. I asked the question aloud, feeling foolish even as the words left my mouth. Should I take the transfer? The planchette began to move immediately, not the halting, jerky motion you'd expect from someone unconsciously pushing it, but a smooth, deliberate glide across the board. WATER. A pause, then continuing with the same eerie confidence. LEADS. Water leads. Or maybe water reads. The lighting was dim and bourbon doesn't improve letter recognition. I'd assumed it meant something about going with the flow, following the current of opportunity. I accepted the transfer the next morning. Now I understand the board's true message, and the spelling was perfect. Water carries. The new office building squats on the edge of the canal like a glass monument to architectural indifference. My department occupies the ground floor, which management calls waterfront access, and I call flood risk. The entire south wall is floor-to-ceiling windows that provide an unobstructed view of the Kanawha Canal and its collection of aged locks and weathered gates. During business hours, the view is almost pleasant. The water moves sluggishly between the concrete banks, occasionally disturbed by a duck or a piece of debris carried down from the mountains. Joggers pass along the walking trail. Couples sit on benches. Normal people living normal lives. It's after hours when the water shows its other face. The first time I stayed late, just catching up on some backlogged reports, I noticed the sound, a rhythmic thudding that seemed to come from the canal itself. At first I assumed it was construction work somewhere upstream, maybe repairs to one of the ancient lock gates. But the sound was too regular, too purposeful, like knocking. That night, I discovered the emergency exit door at the far end of our floor. Painted institutional green and marked with the standard signs, it seemed ordinary enough. But the handle was cold. Not just cool from the building's aggressive air conditioning, but genuinely cold. Cold enough that touching it left my palm tingling. I mentioned the temperature to facilities management the next day. They sent someone to check it out, a guy who spent 30 seconds jiggling the handle and declared it normal. When I pressed him about the cold metal, he looked at me with that particular expression reserved for employees who complain too much. The sound came back 2 nights later. Thud, 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 always in groups of 3 with long pauses between sets. I timed it once, exactly 47 seconds between each series. The pattern never varied. I started staying later just to listen. The building emptied around 6, leaving me alone with the cleaning crew and the security guard who made his rounds every 2 hours. During those quiet evening hours, I began to notice other things. The windows don't just look out onto the canal, they respond to it. When the lock gates open somewhere upstream, allowing water to rush through the system, the glass trembles. It's subtle, barely perceptible unless you're really paying attention. But once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. The vibration travels up from the foundation, through the building's steel frame, and into every pane of glass on the south wall. The company logo is positioned at eye level on the center window, etched in frosted glass that normally appears crisp and professional. But during those tremor episodes, the logo seems to blur, the letters shifting just enough to make you doubt what you're seeing. Sometimes I swear it spells different words entirely. I've started avoiding the conference room they call the deck, a glass-enclosed space that juts out over the canal like the bow of a ship. The architects probably thought they were being clever, creating a dramatic meeting space where important decisions could be made while surrounded by natural beauty. But the way that room sways during high water periods makes my stomach turn. The other employees don't seem to notice, or if they do, they're better at pretending it's normal. My new colleagues have invited me to several meetings out there. I've declined them all, claiming scheduling conflicts or urgent deadlines. They've stopped asking, which should be a relief, but instead feels like exclusion from some crucial understanding. The dream started 3 weeks into the job. Always the same scenario. I'm working late in my glass-walled office when the canal begins to rise. Not dramatically, just a gradual increase that goes unnoticed until the water reaches the walking trail. Then the ground level. Then the foundation of the building. In the dream, I can see the water seeping under the emergency exit door, creating a dark stain that spreads across the carpet in slow motion. The cold handle makes sense then. It's the first part of the building to feel the water's approach. But instead of flooding the office, the water moves with purpose, flowing around obstacles, seeking something specific. It's looking for me. I always wake up before the water reaches my desk, but the sensation lingers throughout the day. The feeling that something is approaching, patient and inexorable. Last Friday, I stayed until almost 10 o'clock, determined to finish a project that had been dragging for weeks. The building was completely empty except for me, or so I thought until I heard voices coming from the direction of the deck. I couldn't make out words, but the rhythm suggested conversation. Multiple speakers, with the casual back and forth of people who know each other well. But when I looked toward the deck, the lights were off, and the space appeared empty. Sound travels strangely around water. Maybe it was people on the far side of the canal, their voices carrying across the surface and bouncing off our windows. That explanation satisfied me until I realized the voices were coming from inside the building, not outside. The emergency exit handle was colder than ever that night. Cold enough that I could see my breath when I stood near it, despite the building's consistent 72-degree climate control. I tried the door once, just to confirm it was locked, and the handle felt like touching a piece of winter. The door opened. It shouldn't have. Emergency exits in commercial buildings are always locked from the inside to prevent unauthorized entry, but this one swung open smoothly, revealing a narrow walkway that led directly to the canal's edge. I could smell the water, that particular odor of stagnant vegetation and urban runoff that marks every city waterway. But I could also hear the voices more clearly now, and they were definitely coming from the water itself. I closed the door quickly and went back to my desk, but the sounds continued through the glass, conversations without words, discussions about things I couldn't quite understand, sometimes laughter, sometimes arguments, but always with that liquid quality that suggested the speakers weren't entirely present. The weekend provided a blessed break from the building, but Monday brought a new development. My computer had been moved, not dramatically, just shifted a few inches to the left, so that my monitor now aligned perfectly with the center of the canal view. The IT department claimed they hadn't touched anything, and the cleaning crew insisted they only emptied trash and vacuumed. But someone had repositioned my entire workstation to optimize my view of the water. I tried moving it back, but something about the new configuration felt right. The angle provided a better perspective on the lock system, allowing me to see the water's movement through the entire visible section of the canal. I could track debris as it floated past, time the intervals between gate operations, and monitor the water level changes throughout the day. I was being prepared to watch something. The realization hit me Tuesday evening as I sat in my precisely positioned chair, staring at the darkening water outside. The Ouija board hadn't been giving me career advice. It had been issuing a warning. Water carries, not opportunities, not dreams, not the metaphorical current of life's flow. Water carries people away. The voices from the canal had been trying to tell me something, and now I was positioned to listen properly. Every evening after the building emptied, they resumed their conversations. Gradually, I began to distinguish individual speakers, recognize recurring themes in their liquid discussions. They were talking about the others who had sat in this chair, at this window, in this perfectly calculated position. The previous occupants of my role, my desk, my view. They spoke about the transfers, the relocations, the opportunities that had led each person to this exact spot. All of them had asked the same question I'd asked that night in O'Malley's basement. All of them had received the same answer. All of them had accepted their transfers, thinking they understood what water leads meant. But they hadn't understood, just like I hadn't understood. Not until it was too late. The emergency exit door grows colder each night, and the voices grow clearer. Soon they'll be clear enough for me to understand exactly what they're discussing. Clear enough for me to join their conversation. I've stopped declining meetings on the deck. Yesterday, I volunteered to stay late for inventory. Tonight, I'm bringing my laptop so I can work right here by the window until the voices call. The Ouija board sits in my desk drawer now. I went back to O'Malley's last week and bought it from the owner, who seemed relieved to get rid of it. Sometimes I take it out and run my fingers over the smooth planchette, feeling the warmth that suggests constant use. Other people must be asking questions somewhere in this city. Other people facing transfers, relocations, opportunities that seem too good to be true. The board will give them the same answer it gave me, spelled with perfect clarity. water carries. And when they accept their new positions, when they find themselves sitting in chairs positioned just right, watching through windows that tremble with the canal's rhythm, they'll finally understand what the board was really telling them. The voices are calling now, rising from the dark water beyond my reflection. The emergency exit handle gleams with frost that shouldn't exist in September's warmth. My chair faces the perfect angle to see everything that matters. I understand now why my predecessor left so suddenly, why the position opened up just when I needed it most, why the board was waiting in that basement, ready with its patient answer. Water carries us all, eventually. The only question is whether you fight the current or let it take you where you were always meant to go. The lock gates are opening upstream. The water is rising. It's time to join the conversation. Story 7. The inheritance came with a 3-page letter written in my great-uncle's spidery handwriting and a brass key that opened nothing I could find. Among the dusty furniture and moth-eaten books in his Chicago brownstone, the display case commanded attention like a monument to precision. 3 figures stood frozen behind the curved glass. A violinist with his bow poised mid-stroke, a waiter balancing an ornate silver tray, and a postman clutching a leather satchel. Each wore the meticulous clothing of early 20th century Paris, their painted faces serene yet somehow expectant. The brass nameplate read, Automatons Parisiens, c. 1908-1912. No maker's mark, no operational instructions. When I lifted each figure to examine their bases, I found identical keyholes, but the inherited key fit none of them. The mechanisms felt solid through their painted wood bodies, gear trains and springs waiting for the turn that would never come. I should have sold them immediately. Instead, I positioned the case in my living room where afternoon light struck the glass just right. The violinist faced slightly toward the center of the room. The waiter angled toward the kitchen doorway, and the postman looked directly at my front door. Their glass eyes held depths that shifted with the changing light, and their porcelain faces bore expressions that seemed to follow my movement around the room. The first sign came 3 days after installation. I noticed it while drinking morning coffee. Oval smudges on the inside of the glass at face level for each figure. Condensation marks, as if breath had fogged the surface from within. I cleaned the exterior with newspaper and vinegar, but the marks remained on the interior, unreachable behind the sealed glass joints. My rational mind supplied explanations: temperature fluctuations, humidity from the nearby radiator, old wood expanding and contracting. But as I stood there with the cleaning rag in my hand, watching those ghostly ovals catch the morning light, something cold settled in my stomach. That evening, I measured the postman's position with a digital level app. He stood exactly perpendicular to the case's back wall. I photographed the reading and saved it with a timestamp. The next morning, he had tilted 2 degrees toward the front door. I spent my lunch break researching antique automaton maintenance, learning about spring tension and environmental factors that might cause gradual shifting. Everything pointed to normal mechanical settling. Yet when I remeasured that evening, the postman had returned to his original position. The pattern emerged over the following weeks. Twice weekly, always on Tuesday and Friday nights, subtle changes occurred. The violinist's bow arm would drop a fraction. The waiter's tray would tip almost imperceptibly. The postman would lean forward, his painted eyes seeming to peer through my front window toward the street beyond. By morning, they always returned to their original positions. I installed a discrete laser pointer focused on the violinist's left eye, its red dot projected onto the wall behind him. On Tuesday nights, the dot would drift 3 millimeters to the right, then slowly return by dawn. I set up a time-lapse camera, but somehow the battery always died during the crucial hours, or the memory card would be mysteriously full despite being empty the night before. Sleep became elusive. I found myself checking the case multiple times each night, convinced I'd caught peripheral movement that stilled the moment I looked directly. The sensation of being watched intensified, pressing against my back as I moved through the apartment. I began keeping the curtains drawn and the lights dim, though I couldn't articulate why. The sound started in week 6. Faint at first, a whispered friction like fabric against fabric, emanating from the case between midnight and 3 a.m. I pressed my ear to the glass and heard what might have been clockwork, the infinitesimal tick of gears engaging and disengaging without any visible external movement. The sound seemed to come from all three figures simultaneously, a synchronized mechanical breathing. Research led me to estate sale records and auction catalogs. The automatons had belonged to a private collector in Montmartre who specialized in theatrical mechanisms. According to a 1913 article in Le Figaro, the collector had commissioned them from an unnamed craftsman who claimed they could perform without winding. "They watch and learn," he'd told the reporter. "Give them an audience, and they'll play forever." The collector's death made less pleasant reading, found in his workshop, apparently of natural causes, though neighbors reported hearing music and the clink of dishes for 3 days after his body was discovered. The automatons had been sold quickly, passed through multiple hands across Europe before eventually crossing the Atlantic. Every owner had kept them briefly. I began to understand why. The watching sensation intensified into something physical, a pressure behind my eyes, a weight on my shoulders. I caught myself holding my breath when passing the case, as if sudden movement might trigger some response. My peripheral vision played tricks, suggesting motion that vanished when I turned to look directly. One October evening, I came home to find the postman's satchel had opened slightly. Not enough for someone unfamiliar with the display to notice, but I knew every detail of their positions by then. Inside the tiny leather bag, barely visible, something white protruded like the corner of a letter. I couldn't reach it through the sealed glass. That night, I dreamed of footsteps in my hallway and woke to find all three figures facing my bedroom doorway. In the morning, they had returned to their original positions, but the postman's satchel remained open, that white corner still visible. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in November. I'd been tracking their movements for 3 months, documenting every shift and return with obsessive precision. The patterns were undeniable, too regular for mechanical settling, too purposeful for random environmental factors. As I sat in my darkened living room at 11:47 p.m., waiting for the night's performance to begin, I realized I was no longer trying to understand the phenomenon. I was waiting for them to acknowledge me. The first sound emerged at exactly midnight, the whisper of cloth against wood, followed by the barely audible tick of engaging springs. In the dim streetlight filtering through my curtains, I watched the violinist's bow begin its imperceptible descent toward the strings. The waiter's tray tilted a degree more, as if offering its contents to an invisible guest. The postman leaned forward, his glass eyes reflecting what little light existed in the room. And for the first time in 3 months, they didn't stop moving when I looked directly at them. The bow continued its descent until it touched the painted strings. No sound emerged, but I heard it anyway. A single, sustained note that seemed to originate from inside my own skull. The waiter's tray completed its offering motion, and I caught the scent of wine and bread, impossible but unmistakable. The postman extended his hand toward me, and I realized the white corner in his satchel wasn't paper. It was an envelope with my name written in my great-uncle's handwriting. I stood, drawn forward despite every instinct screaming retreat. The violinist began a silent melody, his painted fingers moving across strings that should have been frozen in time. The waiter nodded, a host welcoming a long-awaited guest. The postman's smile widened beyond what the original carving should have allowed, and his eyes, his glass eyes that had watched my every movement for months, blinked once in unmistakable recognition. I reached toward the case, my palm pressed against the cool glass that separated us. From within, 3 hands pressed back against mine, warm despite the barrier between us. The condensation marks I'd noticed on my first morning weren't from their breathing. They were from mine. Every time I'd stood here, every time I'd watched them watching me, I'd been the one fogging the glass from the inside. The measurements, the photographs, the careful documentation, all viewed from behind painted eyes that had learned to see, springs that had learned to move, mechanisms that had learned to want. As consciousness ebbed, I understood what my great-uncle's letter had really been telling me. Not an inheritance, but a replacement. Not automatons, but predecessors. The case hadn't been built to display them. It had been built to contain them, and now it needed a new occupant while they moved freely through the world beyond. I blinked, and in that instant between sight and blindness, I saw my reflection in the glass. But the face looking back wore painted features and glass eyes, and my hand, pressing against the barrier, left no condensation mark at all. The violinist lowered his bow with a satisfied smile. The waiter straightened his tray, no longer needing to offer anything. The postman tucked the envelope back into his satchel, its contents delivered at last. Outside the case, 3 figures moved through my apartment with familiar purpose. Inside, I watched through glass eyes as they prepared for the next observer, the next inheritance, the next careful documentation of impossible movements. I try to move, but springs and gears hold me perfectly still. I try to speak, but painted lips allow no sound. I can only watch as they arrange themselves in my living room, 3 antique collectors admiring their newest acquisition. A figure of a man from the early 21st century, perfectly preserved behind curved glass, his expression frozen in perpetual understanding. Sometimes, late at night, I feel the mechanisms in my chest engage. My painted hand rises slightly, my carved features shift almost imperceptibly, and for brief moments, I can lean forward toward whoever might be watching. But by morning, I always return to my position, waiting for the next careful observer to notice the condensation marks appearing at face height, to measure my movements with obsessive precision, to document the impossible until it becomes undeniable, to press their warm palm against the glass where mine waits, cold and still, ready to welcome them home. Story 8. The rental agreement never mentioned the closet's particular habits, though I suppose most landlords wouldn't think to include a clause about unexplained courtesies from inanimate storage spaces. The adobe house on Copper Avenue came furnished with worn hardwood floors that creaked in 17 distinct locations. I'd counted them during my first week, and a linen closet that had apparently been waiting decades for someone to establish proper etiquette. It began on a Thursday in late October, when the desert air hung still, and the house felt too quiet after another soul-crushing day at the insurance office downtown. I'd been living there for 3 months, and the silence had started wearing on me in ways I couldn't articulate. Not the peaceful quiet of contentment, but the hollow quiet of a place holding its breath. That evening, standing in the narrow hallway between the bathroom and bedroom, I felt something watching me from the shadows near the linen closet. The sensation crawled up my spine like cold fingers, and I found myself staring at the wooden door, its surface scarred from years of use. The brass handle had turned green with age, and there was a small crack in the lower right panel that resembled a mouth-frozen mid-whisper. I'd noticed these details before, of course, but that night they seemed more pronounced, as if the door were coming into sharper focus while everything else blurred at the edges. "If there's someone here," I said aloud, my voice carrying further than it should have in the small space, "knock 3 times and spare me from vague signals." The words surprised me as they left my mouth. I wasn't the type to talk to empty rooms or challenge invisible presences. I was a man who filed insurance claims and ate frozen dinners while watching cable news. But the house had been getting to me, making me jumpy at shadows and suspicious of every settling beam. The first knock came from inside the closet, a solid rap against wood that made my chest tighten. The second followed 3 seconds later, deliberate and measured. The third knocked the breath from my lungs entirely. I stood frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs while my rational mind scrambled for explanations. Pipes settling, wood expanding in the cooling night air, a mouse trapped behind the walls. But pipes didn't knock in perfect rhythm, and wood didn't respond to verbal requests with such precise timing. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. The brass felt ice cold against my palm, and when I pulled the door open, a wave of humid air rolled out that smelled overwhelmingly of wet paper and something else. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The closet looked exactly as it always had. Shelves lined with mismatched towels and bed linens, a vacuum cleaner pushed into the back corner, and a stack of boxes labeled in a previous tenant's careful cursive. but the smell persisted, thick enough to taste, and I found myself leaning closer, peering into the corners where the single overhead bulb cast wavering shadows. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet the certainty that something had knocked, had responded to my challenge, sat heavy in my stomach like a stone. I closed the door quickly and pressed my back against the opposite wall, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt in the narrow hallway. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I couldn't explain why an apology seemed necessary. "I didn't mean to, I was just—" The house swallowed my words in its familiar silence, but something had shifted in the quality of that quiet. It no longer felt empty, but expectant, as though the walls themselves were listening. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by the creaking floors and the persistent sense that I was sharing the house with someone, or something, that preferred to remain unseen, but not unacknowledged. The next evening I came home to find the linen closet door standing open perhaps an inch, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness within. The gray wool blanket that usually lay flat on the middle shelf had been folded over, so that one corner hung past the edge, pointing toward the hallway like a beckoning finger. I stood there for 10 minutes, briefcase still in my hand, studying the arrangement. I'd closed that door securely before leaving for work. I was certain of it. The morning routine I'd developed over 3 months was as rigid as my filing system. Shower, coffee, check locks, grab keys, close closet door. I distinctly remembered the soft click of the latch engaging. Yet here it was, opened just enough to catch my attention, the blanket positioned in what could only be described as a greeting. A restrained, almost polite acknowledgement of my presence. I set down my briefcase and approached carefully, half expecting the door to swing wider or slam shut. Instead, it remained perfectly still, that thin line of shadow seeming to pulse with patient waiting. When I pushed it closed, the latch clicked with the same soft finality as always, but I noticed my hand was shaking again. "Thank you," I said to the silence, though I wasn't sure what I was thanking it for. That became the pattern. Each evening I'd return from work to find the door opened precisely 1 finger's width, the gray blanket folded in exactly the same position. At first I told myself I must be forgetting to close it properly, that the house's settling was causing the latch to slip. But after 2 weeks of this ritual, I had to acknowledge that something was maintaining this careful correspondence. The insurance office where I worked was a sterile environment of fluorescent lights and beige cubicles, filled with the constant hum of computers and the rustling of paperwork. I'd always found comfort in its predictability, but now I caught myself checking the clock obsessively, wondering what state I'd find the closet in when I returned home. My coworkers began commenting on my distracted behavior, though I couldn't explain the growing anxiety that followed me through each day. I started taking photographs of the closet before leaving each morning, using my phone to document the exact position of the door and contents. The pictures always showed what I expected. Door firmly closed, everything in its proper place. Yet every evening brought the same discovery, that subtle opening, that careful arrangement of the blanket's corner. The ritual began to consume my thoughts. During lunch breaks, I found myself researching the house's history at the public library, scrolling through decades of city records and newspaper archives. The previous tenants had been a succession of short-term renters, most staying less than a year. None of the records mentioned anything unusual, but I noticed a pattern in the lease dates. Most tenants moved out during the winter months, often with minimal notice to the landlord. I called the property management company under the pretense of reporting a sticky door latch. The woman on the phone, Valerie according to her cheerful greeting, seemed eager to help until I mentioned the address. "Oh, you're at the Copper Avenue place," she said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "How are you finding it there?" "It's fine," I replied carefully, though I did wonder about the previous tenants. The closet door seems to have some settling issues. The rustling stopped. Settling issues? It opens on its own sometimes. I thought maybe it was mentioned in previous reports. A long pause. "Mr. Harrison, I'll be honest with you. That house has had some tenant concerns over the years. Nothing structural, you understand. Just people feeling uncomfortable. If you're having any problems, we'd be happy to show you some other properties." I asked what kind of problems, but Valerie's responses became increasingly vague, filled with phrases like personal comfort and individual sensitivity. When I pressed for specifics, she suggested I speak with the landlord directly, though she seemed reluctant to provide his contact information. That evening, I found myself standing in the hallway earlier than usual, waiting for whatever presence inhabited the closet to make its nightly adjustment. I felt foolish crouched there in my work clothes, watching a door like a surveillance officer. But the compulsion was stronger than my embarrassment. At exactly 6:47 p.m., I'd started checking the time obsessively. I heard the softest sound from within the closet. Not quite a footstep, not quite the rustle of fabric, but something deliberate and careful. The door didn't move, but I could feel the attention focused on the other side, as clearly as if someone were peering through the wood at me. "I know you're there," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "I don't know what you want, but I'm listening." The sound stopped. In the silence that followed, I became aware of my own heartbeat, the whisper of my breathing, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But underneath it all was another rhythm, so faint I might have imagined it. Something like breathing that didn't quite match my own. I waited until nearly midnight, but the door never opened. When I finally gave up and went to bed, I felt as though I'd failed some important test. The next morning, the closet was open wider than usual, perhaps 3 inches, and not just the corner of the gray blanket was visible, but a portion of the white towel beside it. Both were folded outward in what looked unmistakably like a more elaborate greeting, as if my attempted communication had been acknowledged and reciprocated. I began staying up later, positioning myself in the hallway with a book or my laptop, ostensibly reading or working, but actually watching the closet door with peripheral vision. The presence seemed to be growing bolder, or perhaps more comfortable with my attention. Sometimes I heard soft sounds from within, not knocking anymore, but gentle movements, like someone carefully rearranging items on shelves. My sleep became increasingly fragmented. I'd wake at odd hours with the certainty that someone was moving through the house. But when I investigated, I found only the usual signs. The closet door opened its precise width, the blanket arranged in its customary greeting. Nothing else was ever disturbed. Nothing ever moved except for those 2 elements that had become our entire language. I started leaving small gifts on the floor outside the closet. Nothing elaborate. A mint from a restaurant, a smooth stone I'd found in the backyard, a paperclip bent into an interesting shape. Each morning the items were gone, though I never found them anywhere else in the house. It occurred to me that I was feeding something, and I wasn't sure whether that thought terrified or comforted me. The isolation was getting to me. I'd never been particularly social, but now I found myself avoiding friends' calls and declining invitations to join colleagues for drinks after work. How could I explain that I needed to get home to check on a linen closet? That I'd developed a relationship with something that might not even exist outside my own increasingly fragmented psyche? I began to question everything. Was I actually seeing the door open each evening, or was my mind supplying the expected image? Were the sounds real, or had I become so sensitized to the house's normal settling that I was interpreting random noises as purposeful communication? The photographs on my phone showed a consistently closed door each morning, but photographs could be misleading, and memory was notoriously unreliable. Yet the routine continued with mathematical precision. Each evening, door opened exactly 1 finger's width, blanket folded in its careful greeting. Each night before bed, I would approach the closet, gently close the door, and whisper my own goodnight to whatever might be listening. The protocol had become as essential to my daily rhythm as brushing my teeth or locking the front door. I couldn't imagine breaking it, couldn't conceive of simply ignoring the door, or, worse yet, moving to a different house and abandoning whatever entity had taken such care to establish this delicate correspondence. But as October melted into November and the desert nights grew colder, I began to notice changes in the pattern. The door started opening slightly wider, first 1.5 inches, then 2 inches, then 3. The blanket's fold became more pronounced, and sometimes I found other items rearranged. A washcloth draped over the shelf's edge, a towel folded into an unusual triangle shape. The gifts I left disappeared more quickly, sometimes vanishing while I was still in the house. I'd place a button or a smooth pebble outside the closet before dinner, and when I checked an hour later, it would be gone. Whatever was taking them was growing bolder, more active during the daylight hours when I was present. I started talking to the closet during these interactions, carrying on one-sided conversations about my day at work, the weather, random thoughts that occurred to me. I felt ridiculous, but also oddly comforted by the sense that someone, something, was listening. The quality of the silence in the hallway changed when I spoke, becoming more attentive, more focused. "I don't know what you are," I said one evening in mid-November, standing directly in front of the partially open door. "I don't know what you want from me, or why you chose this house, this closet. But I want you to know that I'm not afraid anymore. This arrangement we have, it's working for both of us, isn't it?" The house held its breath. Then, so softly I almost missed it, came the sound of fabric shifting against wood, and the gray blanket's corner moved slightly, as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. That night I dreamed of standing in the hallway, but the closet door was wide open, and I could see deep into a space that extended much further than the physical dimensions of the house should have allowed. Rows of shelves stretched into misty darkness, lined with folded linens in shades I'd never seen before. At the very back, barely visible in the dreamlight, a figure sat motionless, face turned toward me with patient attention. I woke with the absolute certainty that something fundamental had changed. The protocol we'd established was evolving, and I wasn't sure I was prepared for whatever came next. When I checked the closet that morning before work, the door was closed as always. But when I opened it to grab a clean towel, I found a small object sitting on the middle shelf that I'd never seen before. A origami crane folded from what looked like pages torn from an old book, its wings spread as if caught in mid-flight. I picked it up with trembling fingers. The paper was yellowed and brittle, and I could see fragments of text printed on it, something about insurance policies and liability claims, though the words seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on them. I was still holding the crane when I arrived at work, and I spent the entire day staring at it while it sat on my desk, trying to convince myself it was something I'd made and forgotten, some project from my childhood that had somehow found its way into the closet. But I knew better. Whatever lived in that narrow space between the bathroom and bedroom had moved beyond simple greetings and was now offering gifts of its own, crafted from materials I couldn't identify, and possessing a delicate beauty that filled me with both wonder and a growing sense of unease. The protocol was no longer just about acknowledgement. It was becoming something deeper, more complex, and as I sat in my sterile cubicle surrounded by the mundane reality of actuarial tables and claim forms, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into a correspondence that would demand more of me than I was prepared to give. That evening, I stood in the hallway for a long time before approaching the closet, the origami crane still clutched in my palm, wondering if I was losing my mind or finding something that had been waiting for me all along. Story 9. The silence followed me home from Providence Portland Medical Center like a stray dog, persistent, unwelcome, and somehow familiar despite being completely wrong. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty house, but something thick and expectant, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The taxi driver had commented on the unusual stillness when he dropped me off, how even the typical Portland drizzle seemed muted against the windows, but I'd attributed it to the lingering effects of whatever cocktail of medications they'd been feeding me for 3 days. Exhaustion, they'd called it. Severe anxiety with dissociative episodes. Clinical terms for what felt like my mind had simply decided to take a vacation without informing the rest of me. The discharge papers crinkled in my jacket pocket as I stood in my living room, surveying the space that should have felt like sanctuary, but instead felt like stepping into a photograph of my own life. Recognizable, but fundamentally altered in ways I couldn't articulate. The first night, I blamed the light bulbs on coincidence. I'd flicked the switch for the overhead fixture in the bedroom, and both bulbs had popped simultaneously. Not the gradual dimming of dying filaments, but sharp, decisive failures that left thin wisps of smoke curling toward the ceiling. The sound was wrong too. like glass cracking underwater. I stood there in the sudden darkness, listening to my own breathing and the subtle settling sounds of a house that had been empty for days, and felt the first whisper of something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't relief either. The living room lamps went next, again in perfect synchronization. Then the bathroom vanity lights, always in pairs, never singles, as if whatever was happening followed its own precise logic that had nothing to do with electrical systems or the age of the fixtures. By the fourth set, the kitchen pendant lights over the breakfast bar, I'd stopped replacing them immediately. Instead, I found myself moving through the house in deliberate shadow, using only the ambient light that filtered through the windows and the cold glow of electronics. It was in this half-darkness that I first noticed the figure. Not noticed, exactly. Became aware of. Like realizing you've been hearing a sound for minutes before your conscious mind acknowledges it. There, in the space between my bed and the dresser, where the mirror should have reflected the muted flicker of the television screen, was an absence, not a shadow. Shadows have edges, boundaries, logical relationships to light sources. This was more like a place where vision simply stopped. Tall, roughly humanoid in its dimensions, but with a quality that made my eyes want to slide away from it, the way they might from a bright light or a particularly disturbing image. The entity, for lack of a better word, never moved in ways I could observe directly, but its position would shift. Sometimes it stood closer to the foot of the bed, sometimes nearer the window, occasionally positioned in a way that blocked exactly half of the TV's reflection in the mirror. Always blocking something, always creating a deliberation disruption in the normal geography of the room. What disturbed me more than seeing nothing was hearing everything, my own thoughts, but in a voice that carried inflections I'd never used, suggesting courses of action that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. Why keep trying? The words would surface in my mind with the cadence of gentle reason. You've already proven you can't handle the basic requirements of existence. Look how easily you broke down. Look how little it took. The voice never shouted, never demanded. It offered observations with the patience of someone reading aloud from a particularly compelling book. You could simply stop. Stop the routines, stop the pretending, stop the exhausting performance of being functional. No one would blame you. They'd understand, given recent events. I began to suspect that my hospitalization hadn't been the end of something, but the beginning. The research team arrived on a Thursday, responding to what I'd described over the phone as unusual environmental factors in my home. 3 people with equipment cases and the kind of matter-of-fact professionalism that made me feel simultaneously validated and foolish. They introduced themselves with first names only, something about maintaining scientific objectivity, and began setting up instruments whose purposes I could only guess at. The electromagnetic field reader began clicking almost immediately after they turned it on, a steady rhythm like a Geiger counter in a reactor. The woman operating it, a compact person with prematurely gray hair and surprisingly gentle hands, moved it slowly around the bedroom until she reached the space between the bed and dresser. "There," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Right here." The clicking became rapid, almost frantic, and the digital display showed numbers that made her colleagues exchange meaningful glances. She moved the device away from the spot. The clicking slowed. Back to the spot. Rapid fire again. Whatever was generating the field wasn't just present. It was stationary, as if something had taken up permanent residence in that particular cubic foot of air. "It's like..." The younger man with the tablet computer began, then stopped himself. "Like what?" I prompted. "Like something's leaning against the wall," the older man with the thermal imaging camera finished, "except there's nothing there." They documented everything, photographs of the space from multiple angles, thermal readings that showed a consistent cool spot despite the room's even heating, electromagnetic measurements that defied their expectations. Through it all, I found myself watching their faces more than their instruments, looking for the moment when professional curiosity would give way to the same unsettled recognition I'd been living with. That moment came when they played back the audio recording. They'd set up sensitive microphones throughout the room, the kind used for paranormal investigation but repurposed for environmental monitoring. When they played back the recordings through their equipment, the sound was subtle but unmistakable, a low-frequency hum, almost below the threshold of conscious perception, emanating from the same spot where their other instruments detected anomalies. But there was something else, embedded in the static and ambient noise, something that sounded almost like whispering. Words just below the edge of comprehension, delivered in a rhythm that felt familiar despite being completely unintelligible. The lead researcher, the woman with the gray hair, looked up from her equipment with an expression I couldn't read. "Have you been experiencing any auditory phenomena? Voices, perhaps?" I told her about the thoughts that weren't quite my thoughts, the suggestions that arrived in my mind with foreign inflections. She nodded as if this was exactly what she'd expected to hear, made notes on a pad that she kept angled away from my view, and began packing up their equipment with sudden efficiency. "We'd like to return tomorrow with additional instruments," she said, avoiding direct eye contact. "There are some readings we'd like to verify." I told them not to come back. The words surprised me as much as them, emerging with a certainty I hadn't felt since returning from the hospital. Something about their presence, their professional interest in cataloging and understanding, felt like an invasion, not of my privacy, but of whatever delicate balance I'd unknowingly established with the thing that had taken up residence in my bedroom. After they left, I made my own adjustments. The 2 lamps that consistently burned out, the bedside table fixtures that had failed and been replaced 6 times in the past 2 weeks, I left unplugged, not just switched off but disconnected entirely, their cords coiled neatly behind the nightstand like sleeping snakes. The overhead light remained permanently dark, its switch taped down with electrical tape I'd found in the kitchen junk drawer. The window, I discovered, needed to remain precisely 1 hand width open, not fully closed, which seemed to increase the electromagnetic activity, according to my own amateur observations with a compass. Not fully open, which somehow made the whispered suggestions more insistent, more difficult to distinguish from my own internal monologue. But cracked exactly the width of my palm, creating a narrow channel of airflow that seemed to moderate whatever forces were at work. Most importantly, I began to vocalize my intentions. Each morning, standing in the bedroom doorway with the figure occupying its customary space between bed and dresser, I would announce my plans for the day, not speaking to it directly. That felt like acknowledging something I wasn't ready to acknowledge, but speaking aloud in its presence, as if the simple act of articulating my intentions created some form of contract. "Today I'm going to the grocery store at 10:30, I would say, addressing the mirror rather than the absence that blocked half its reflection. "I'll buy milk, bread, and something for dinner. I'll be back by noon. Then I'll work on the consulting project until 4, take a walk around the neighborhood, and make dinner." The specificity seemed important. Vague plans, "I'll run some errands," or "I'll get some work done," resulted in increased activity, more lights burning out, stronger electromagnetic readings on the compass I'd started carrying, and voices that felt less like suggestions and more like commands. But detailed itineraries, spoken with calm confidence, seemed to create a buffer of normalcy that lasted throughout the day. I began to think of it as negotiation, not with the supernatural necessarily, but with whatever part of my own mind had fractured during those missing days in the hospital. The research team had detected something measurable, something that registered on their instruments and defied their explanations, but that didn't necessarily make it external. Traumatic breaks from reality could manifest in ways that seemed to affect the physical environment. Electromagnetic sensitivity brought on by neurological changes, perception distortions that created the illusion of presences, auditory hallucinations sophisticated enough to register on recording equipment. Or maybe I was trying to rationalize something that couldn't be rationalized. The truth was, the daily announcements worked. The voice in my mind, my voice, but not my voice, became quieter, less insistent. The figure in the bedroom remained, but its presence felt less oppressive, more like sharing space with a roommate who preferred to keep to themselves. The light bulbs stopped burning out entirely, though I kept the bedside lamps unplugged as a precaution. Weeks passed in this routine. Wake, announce the day's schedule, follow through with methodical precision, return each evening to make minor adjustments to the window opening or the positioning of the unplugged lamps. I began to sleep better, work more effectively, even socialize occasionally with neighbors I'd been avoiding since my return from the hospital. But the normalization brought its own form of unease. Because if this was healing, if the careful management of environmental factors and the vocalization of daily plans was genuinely therapeutic, then what did that say about the nature of my break from reality? If I could negotiate my way back to functionality through such specific, almost ritualistic behaviors, what did that suggest about the mechanisms of mental breakdown? And if it wasn't healing, if the electromagnetic readings and the audio recordings and the systematic burning out of light bulbs had been genuine manifestations of something external, then what did it mean that I'd found a way to coexist with it? The question that kept me awake, staring at the ceiling, while the figure occupied its familiar space near the dresser, was whether there was actually a difference. On a rainy Tuesday in late October, nearly 2 months after my discharge from the hospital, I realized I had stopped checking the compass for electromagnetic fluctuations. The daily readings had become so consistent, a slight deviation near the bed-to-dresser space, normal everywhere else, that I'd internalized them as part of the room's natural character, like the way certain floorboards creaked or the window rattled in strong wind. Standing in the doorway that morning, preparing to announce my schedule for the day, I looked toward the mirror and realized I could no longer distinguish between the space the figure occupied and the space it left empty. The absence had become so familiar that my eyes automatically adjusted for it, the way vision compensates for the blind spot where the optic nerve connects to the retina. Today I'm meeting with the client at 2, I said to my reflection, which looked back at me with an expression I didn't quite recognize. I'll present the quarterly analysis, discuss the contract renewal, and confirm the deadlines for the next phase. I'll be home by 6 to make dinner and work on the monthly reports. My voice sounded steady, professional, completely normal. But as I turned to leave the bedroom, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. Not the figure, which had been there every day for 2 months, but my own reflection in the window glass, distorted by the morning light and the narrow opening I'd maintained so carefully. For just a moment, the reflection looked like it was speaking to someone standing just outside the frame, someone tall enough to block exactly half of whatever was behind them, someone who had been listening patiently to every word I'd spoken, every plan I'd announced, every negotiation I'd thought I was conducting with myself. I left the window exactly 1 palm width open and went to make coffee, wondering if the conversation I'd been having all these weeks had been with the entity in my bedroom, or if I was the entity in someone else's. The coffee maker clicked on with its usual mechanical precision, and somewhere behind me, 2 light bulbs that I'd never plugged back in began to glow with a soft, steady warmth that had nothing to do with electricity. Story 10. The screw hit my temple with the gentleness of a raindrop, then clattered onto the rug below. I paused the episode mid-dialogue, remote still clutched in my hand, and stared down at the small silver object nestled between the carpet fibers. It was coated in a fine layer of dust, the kind that accumulates in forgotten corners and beneath heavy doors. I recognized it immediately, the same Phillips head screw I'd left on the kitchen counter 20 minutes earlier, after fixing the cabinet hinge that had been driving me insane for weeks with its persistent creak. I'd set it there deliberately, planning to find the right spot for it later, maybe the loose switch plate in the hallway, or that wobbling shelf bracket in the bathroom. But now here it was, having somehow traveled from the kitchen, through the living room, and apparently through the air to tap against my skull like an impatient finger. The house was still. No breeze stirred through the rooms. I'd checked the windows twice before settling in to watch television. The air conditioning hadn't cycled on in over an hour. There was no logical explanation for how that screw had moved from point A to point B, let alone how it had gained enough momentum to strike me from above. I picked it up, rolling the metal between my fingers. The dust felt gritty, familiar. It reminded me of the residue I'd swept from beneath the kitchen door last week. The same fine gray powder that seemed to accumulate wherever the old house's joints met imperfectly. Standing, I made my way to the kitchen, flipping on lights as I went. The counter where I'd left the screw was empty, save for the small pile of washers and nuts I'd removed from the hinge assembly. I counted them twice. Everything else was accounted for. Okay, I thought. Maybe I knocked it off somehow and it rolled. But that didn't explain the trajectory, or the dust, or the gentle precision with which it had found my temple. I examined the ceiling above where I'd been sitting, searching for cracks or gaps that might explain its origin. Nothing. The surface was smooth, recently painted, without so much as a hairline fissure. I pocketed the screw and returned to the couch, but the episode had lost its appeal. My attention kept drifting to the corners of the room, to the shadows that seemed deeper than usual, to the subtle sounds that old houses make when they settle into themselves for the night. 3 days later, it happened again. I'd been replacing the weather stripping around the bathroom window, a tedious job that required removing dozens of small finishing nails. I'd organized them in neat rows on the sink counter, planning to reinstall them once the new stripping was in place. But when I returned from the garage to retrieve my hammer, I found that half the nails were missing. A methodical search of the bathroom floor turned up nothing. I even moved the sink cabinet and peered behind the toilet, thinking they might have scattered. But the nails had simply vanished, as if they'd never existed. I was measuring out new nails from my toolbox when I noticed something that made my hands freeze mid-motion. The bathroom door, which I'd removed earlier to work on the frame, was leaning against the hallway wall. And there, driven into the gaps where the old weather stripping had been, were my missing nails, each one precisely placed, driven flush with the wood, holding down fresh strips of the exact weather stripping I'd been about to install. The work was perfect, professional, better than I would have done it myself. I approached the door slowly, my heartbeat loud in my ears. The new weather stripping was the same brand and color as what I'd purchased, but I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't installed it. I'd barely unpacked the materials when I'd gone to the garage. My hands shook as I examined the installation. Every nail was straight, every cut precise. The corners were mitered at perfect 45-degree angles, something I'd been dreading because I'd always been terrible at getting them right. But these were flawless. I spent the rest of the day checking and rechecking my tools, my materials, my memory of the sequence of events. But no amount of rationalization could explain what I'd found. The house, it seemed, had completed my work for me. Over the following weeks, the phenomenon escalated. I began leaving incomplete projects intentionally, testing the boundaries of whatever was happening. A half-installed towel rack in the guest bathroom appeared fully mounted the next morning, with screws I didn't remember purchasing. A loose baseboard I'd been meaning to nail down was found secure and freshly caulked, the gaps filled with a precision that made my own amateur attempts look sloppy by comparison. Each completion was accompanied by subtle signs: the scent of fresh sawdust where no saw had been used, the whisper of settling wood in rooms where I hadn't worked. Tools moved fractional distances from where I'd left them. Not enough to be certain, but enough to notice. I started staying awake at night, listening. The house breathed around me with creaks and sighs that I'd never paid attention to before, but now I found myself parsing each sound, trying to identify the difference between normal settling and something more deliberate. Footsteps, maybe, or the careful tap of a hammer in distant rooms. Sometimes I thought I heard it, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. But whenever I got up to investigate, the sounds would stop, leaving only the familiar silence of a house at rest. My sleep became fitful, interrupted by dreams of invisible hands working in darkness, of screws turning themselves into wood, of projects completing themselves while I lay helpless in bed. I began locking my bedroom door, though I couldn't articulate what I was trying to keep out. The morning I found the kitchen completely reorganized, I knew I was either losing my mind or sharing my home with something that had very definite opinions about proper maintenance. Every cabinet door hung perfectly straight. The drawer pulls that had been slightly loose were now tight and aligned. The faucet, which had developed an annoying drip, ran without a single stray drop. Even the tile grout, which I'd been planning to reseal for months, appeared fresh and pristine. I hadn't touched any of it. I called in sick to work, and spent the day documenting everything with my phone camera, taking pictures from multiple angles, measurements, notes about what had changed. The evidence was undeniable, but also impossible to explain to anyone who hadn't witnessed it. That evening, I sat in the living room and addressed the empty air. "I know you're there," I said, feeling foolish but desperate for some kind of acknowledgement. "I know you're fixing things. Why?" The house remained silent. But as night fell, the sounds began again. Clearer now, as if my acknowledgement had given them permission to be more obvious. I heard the whisper of sandpaper against wood, the soft percussion of nails being driven into place, the gentle scrape of tools moving across surfaces. I followed the sounds to their source. The basement door I'd been meaning to replace for years. The frame was warped. The wood split along the edges where decades of humidity had taken their toll. I'd purchased a new door months ago, but it still leaned against the garage wall, waiting for a free weekend that never seemed to come. Now, as I stood at the top of the basement stairs, I could hear the unmistakable sound of someone working below, measuring, cutting, fitting pieces together with patient precision. My hand found the light switch, but I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to see what was down there. Part of me was terrified that I would see nothing at all, that the sounds were products of a mind coming apart at the seams, but a larger part of me needed to know. I flicked the switch. The basement was empty, but the work continued. Tools moved through the air as if guided by invisible hands. A level floated horizontally, adjusting itself against the doorframe. A drill bit spun without a drill to drive it, boring pilot holes with mechanical precision. Pieces of wood shifted and aligned themselves, held in place by nothing I could see while screws turned themselves into the grain. I watched, transfixed, as my basement door was methodically, expertly replaced by forces I couldn't begin to understand. The old door was carefully disassembled and stacked in neat piles. The new one was fitted with measurements so precise, they must have been calculated to the fraction of an inch. Throughout the process, I felt observed. Not malevolently, but with the same careful attention a craftsman might pay to a particularly challenging joint. Whatever was working in my basement was as aware of my presence as I was of its activity. When the work was finished, the tools settled gently onto my workbench. The basement fell silent except for the soft whisper of wood settling into its new configuration. I climbed the stairs on unsteady legs and tried the new door. It opened and closed with the smooth precision of a piece of fine furniture. The fit was perfect, the finish flawless. That night, I lay in bed listening to the housework around me. The sounds came from everywhere now. Attic, walls, crawl space. A symphony of invisible repair and improvement. I could hear problems being identified and methodically solved. A loose floorboard secured, a drafty window sealed, wiring rerouted through walls with the skill of a master electrician. My house was healing itself. By morning, every flaw I'd been aware of, and several I hadn't, had been addressed. The place hummed with the satisfaction of mechanical perfection. But I found no peace in this completeness, because I was beginning to understand what the house wanted in return. I noticed it first in small ways. Tools that were difficult to put down. Screws that seemed to guide my hand toward problems I hadn't noticed. A compulsion to examine every corner, every joint, every surface for signs of wear or damage. The house was teaching me to see it through its eyes, not as a shelter, but as a living system of interconnected parts that required constant attention. And I was becoming an extension of that system, driven by needs that weren't entirely my own. I tried to leave, packed a bag and made it as far as the front door before finding myself returning to examine a loose threshold that hadn't been loose an hour before. The house was subtly incomplete again, just enough to draw me back, to make leaving feel like abandonment. Now, as I write this, I can hear it calling to me. A dripping faucet that wasn't dripping yesterday. A cabinet door that's developed a barely perceptible sag. Imperfections that pull at the edges of my consciousness like physical pain. I understand now why the house returns the spare parts. Nothing can remain unfinished here. Every screw must find its proper hole. Every nail its intended board. The house and I have become partners in an endless project of perfection. And I'm no longer certain which of us is the tool and which is the craftsman. The work must continue. It must always continue. Story 11. The emails arrive on Thursdays now, always Thursdays, with subject lines that make my coffee taste like copper. Workforce optimization update. Departmental restructuring notice. Employee transition announcement. Each one sends the same electric crawl up my spine, the same phantom sensation of fingers slipping on something that shouldn't exist. It's been 8 months since the basement incident, and I still can't explain what happened that night in Knoxville. What I can explain is simpler and somehow worse. Every prediction that thing made has come true. The basement belonged to Chen's rental house on Cumberland Avenue, a cramped space that reeked of mildew and something sweeter, maybe rotting insulation, maybe something else entirely. We'd gathered there on a Tuesday in February, 5 software engineers trapped by another endless Tennessee winter, and the particular brand of existential dread that comes from debugging legacy code for 12 hours straight. We need a distraction, Chen had announced, producing a roll of brown paper from somewhere in his kitchen. Something analog, something that doesn't involve screens. That's how we ended up hunched around his coffee table at midnight, sketching out a crude board game with ballpoint pens and rulers that kept slipping in the humid air. The basement felt smaller with all of us crammed in there, the ceiling pressing down like a lid. The single bulb overhead cast everything in harsh, stuttering light. The electrical wiring in that old house was questionable at best. The game itself was nonsense, really. A spiral path drawn in unsteady lines, decorated with squares we'd labeled with random penalties and rewards. Lose a turn, move ahead 3 spaces. Ask a question. We'd fashioned dice from torn cardboard and made game pieces from bottle caps we'd scrounged from Chen's recycling bin, but the centerpiece was different. Instead of buying it or making it ourselves, we'd found it. I discovered the thing when I'd gone upstairs to grab another beer. It was sitting on Chen's kitchen counter, though I could have sworn the surface had been clear when we'd arrived. A rocks glass, heavy and substantial, with an odd smoky tint to the crystal. When I picked it up, my fingers nearly slipped. The surface felt slick, almost greasy, despite appearing perfectly clean. Where'd this come from? I'd called down to the basement. Chen's voice drifted up the stairs, muffled and distracted. What glass? I brought it down anyway. It felt important somehow, necessary. The others barely glanced at it when I set it in the center of our makeshift board, though I noticed how the overhead light seemed to bend strangely around its edges. We played for maybe an hour, moving our bottle cap pieces around the spiral, laughing at the arbitrary rules we kept inventing. The basement grew warmer as the night progressed, the air thick and close. Someone mentioned that the HVAC system was acting up again, but I don't remember who. Then Garrett landed on one of our Ask a Question squares. Garrett worked in our sister office downtown, a quiet guy with premature gray hair and a nervous laugh. He'd been angling for a remote position for months, applying for transfers within the company that would let him work from home. The rejections kept coming back with the same corporate non-language about current business needs and team collaboration requirements. All right, Garrett said, settling back on his heels. He was sweating despite the basement's chill. I remember that. Will I get that remote position I applied for? The question hung in the air for a moment. We all looked at the glass in the center of the board, though I'm not sure why. It wasn't like we'd established any rules about how this was supposed to work. The whole thing was improvised, a joke to pass the time. That's when my hand moved. I felt it before I saw it. My right hand sliding across the smooth surface of Chen's coffee table toward the glass. Not moved by me, but moving nonetheless. Fingers extended like I was reaching for something just out of grasp. The sensation was unmistakable. No muscular effort, no conscious decision. Just the strange glide of skin against something that felt simultaneously solid and insubstantial. My fingers wrapped around the glass, and I felt that greasy slip again, like trying to hold ice with wet hands. The crystal was warm now, almost fever-hot, and seemed to vibrate against my palm. The words came from my mouth, but I didn't speak them. He's already somewhere else. The basement went silent. Even the house itself seemed to pause. No more creaking from upstairs, no hum from the struggling HVAC, no whisper of winter wind through the foundation cracks. Just my voice hanging in the stale air and 5 pairs of eyes staring at me. "Dude," someone said eventually. I think it was Parker. What the hell was that supposed to mean? I set the glass down carefully, my hand shaking. I don't know. I wasn't trying to say anything. Garrett laughed, but it sounded forced. Already somewhere else? Like, metaphysically? Spiritually? That's either really deep or complete bullshit. We tried to keep playing after that, but the mood had shifted. The basement felt colder somehow, despite the thick air. The light bulb overhead seemed to flicker more frequently, casting moving shadows that made our crude game board look like something much older and more deliberate. We called it a night around 2 a.m. I was the last to leave, helping Chen fold up the paperboard and sweep the bottle caps into a drawer. The glass had disappeared again. Neither of us remembered putting it away, and we couldn't find it when we looked. "Weird night," Chen said as I headed up the basement stairs. I agreed, but I was already beginning to suspect that weird was an insufficient word for what had happened. 2 months later, the email arrived in Garrett's inbox on a Tuesday morning. Immediate transfer to the Atlanta branch due to an unexpected merger between our department and a subsidiary he'd never heard of. The position was fully remote, effective immediately. He'd be working from his apartment, reporting to managers he'd never meet in person. "He's already somewhere else," I whispered to myself when Garrett forwarded the announcement to our group chat. The words tasted like copper. That's when the other predictions started revealing themselves. Chen had asked about his lease renewal that night, landing on an ask a question square 20 minutes after Garrett's turn. I remembered the glass growing warm in my hand again, my voice speaking words I didn't choose. The foundation decides for itself. 3 weeks later, Chen found cracks running through his basement walls, serious structural damage that the landlord claimed had appeared overnight. The house was condemned pending repairs that never materialized. Chen moved out within a month. Parker had asked about his girlfriend, some concern about their relationship that I barely remembered the details of. The glass had told him, she sees through different windows now. 2 weeks later, she broke up with him via text message. She'd been seeing someone else. Someone from her yoga class who lived across town. She moved in with the new guy before Parker even finished processing the betrayal. Every question we'd asked that night had received an answer, and every answer was coming true with surgical precision. But the predictions weren't helping anyone. They were simply describing disasters that seemed to arrange themselves around us like furniture in a room we'd never been invited to enter. The worst part was realizing we'd asked more questions than I initially remembered. Memory is funny that way, especially when you're trying to forget something. But as the months passed and the predictions kept manifesting, more of that night came back to me in fragments. I had asked something too. It came to me during a particularly restless night in June, my brain cycling through the familiar loop of anxiety and rational denial that had become my default state. I bolted upright in bed, sweat cold despite the summer heat, as the memory clicked into place. Will I ever stop thinking about tonight? That had been my question. The last one of the evening, asked just before we decided to quit the game. I remembered now, my hand moving toward the glass one final time, that same greasy slip of crystal against palm, the heat building in the smoky depths. The answer, you'll think about it more clearly. At the time, I'd assumed this meant I'd eventually understand what had happened, that clarity would bring peace. But as the months stretched on and the predictions kept coming true with their horrible accuracy, I began to understand the real meaning. I wasn't going to stop thinking about it. I was going to think about it more clearly, with increasing focus and precision, until it became the only thing I thought about at all. The Thursday emails were just the beginning. Every corporate communication, every minor administrative change, every routine announcement about personnel shifts or policy updates, they all felt connected now, part of some vast organizational chart that extended beyond our company, beyond our industry. beyond any human-controlled system. I started printing them out and spreading them across my apartment floor, looking for patterns. The language was always the same, carefully neutral, professionally distant, describing changes that had already been decided by people whose names never appeared in the communications. It has been determined. The decision has been made, effective immediately. No one was making these decisions. The decisions were simply appearing, like cracks in a foundation, like breakups via text message, like transfer orders for jobs that materialized out of corporate restructuring that no one had planned. By October, I'd stopped sleeping more than 3 hours at a time. Every dream featured basements, not Chen's basement specifically, but the idea of basements, underground spaces where important things happen in the dark. I'd wake up with the taste of copper in my mouth and my right hand tingling, as if I'd been gripping something hot and slippery all night. The rational part of my mind, the part trained to debug code and identify logical errors, kept insisting this was all elaborate coincidence seasoned with confirmation bias and sleep deprivation. People get transferred. Relationships end. Buildings develop structural problems. None of it required supernatural explanation. But the rational part was getting quieter these days, drowned out by a growing certainty that we'd stumbled onto something that night in February. Something that had been waiting in Chen's basement. Or maybe in any basement. All basements. The collective unconscious space beneath every building where the foundation meets the earth. The glass had shown us how decisions really get made, I realized. Not by people in boardrooms or government offices, but by some deeper system that operated beyond human awareness. We think we're choosing our jobs, our relationships, our living situations, but we're just receiving notifications about choices that have already been made for us by forces that don't bother to explain themselves. And once you've seen how it works, once you've felt your hand move without your permission and heard your voice speak words you didn't choose, you start to recognize the pattern everywhere. Last Thursday's email was different from the others. Instead of announcing someone else's transfer or department restructuring, it was addressed to me directly. A lateral move, they called it. An opportunity in a newly created position that would be fully remote, reporting to managers I'd never met. Your transition has been approved, the email read. Please confirm your acceptance by responding to this message. I sat staring at my laptop screen for 20 minutes, my coffee growing cold, that familiar copper taste flooding my mouth. My right hand hovered over the keyboard, fingers trembling slightly. I hadn't applied for any position. I'd never heard of the department they wanted to transfer me to. The salary they offered was exactly what I would have asked for if anyone had bothered to ask me what I wanted. My hand moved toward the trackpad, cursor floating over the reply button. That same sensation washed through me, the greasy slip, the absence of muscular control, the certainty that something else was making this choice for me. But this time, I pulled my hand back. This time I closed the laptop and walked away. I'm writing this now from a coffee shop across town, using their Wi-Fi and a notebook I bought with cash. My work laptop is still sitting on my kitchen table, closed, the email unanswered. My phone is turned off and sitting in a drawer at home. Maybe I'm having a breakdown. Maybe 8 months of sleep deprivation and paranoid thinking have finally pushed me past the point of rational thought. Maybe there never was a supernatural glass in Chen's basement, just a group of stressed engineers playing with improvised props and experiencing group hysteria. But I keep thinking about that final prediction, the one that came from my own mouth in response to my own question. You'll think about it more clearly. I am thinking about it more clearly now, clear enough to see the pattern, clear enough to understand that every email, every corporate decision, every supposedly random life change is part of a system so vast and interconnected that individual human choice becomes irrelevant. Clear enough to realize that by not responding to Thursday's email, I haven't escaped the pattern. I've simply moved to a different part of it, one where the consequences won't arrive as neat corporate communications, but as something else entirely, something that won't bother to give me advance notice. The barista just called out a name for a drink order, and for a split second, it sounded like my name. But when I looked up, no one was there to claim it. The coffee sits abandoned on the counter, growing cold, steam rising like a question that will never be answered. My right hand is tingling again. Story 12. And the first thing you need to understand about Lubbock is that it's flat, in a way that makes you feel exposed, like God's own microscope slide stretched under an infinite sky. When I moved into the West Wind condominiums last September, I thought the isolation would be therapeutic. 3 months after the divorce, I craved that particular brand of loneliness that only comes from wide open spaces, and the kind of quiet that rings in your ears. The condo sat at the complex's eastern edge, backing up to a field that stretched toward the horizon in an unbroken carpet of dormant grass and scattered mesquite. During the day, that field looked innocent enough, maybe a little too perfect, too uniform, like someone had taken great care to maintain its emptiness. But at night, especially when the moon was new, it became something else entirely. A void, a mouth. I'd been living there exactly 43 days when it happened. The evening of November 1st had been unremarkable. I'd spent it the way I spent most evenings then, nursing a beer on the back patio, watching the sun bleed out over the field, while trying not to think about the papers I'd signed that morning or the job I'd left behind in Dallas, or the way my ex-wife's lawyer had smiled when she'd mentioned the restraining order. The temperature had dropped with the sun, and by 11 I was ready to call it a night. I was brushing my teeth when the sound hit. It wasn't like any engine I'd ever heard. Too low, too organic somehow, as if someone had taught a diesel motor to breathe. The vibration reached me before the sound did, a thrumming that started in my chest and spread outward until my bathroom mirror rattled against the wall and the toothbrush tumbled from my hand. The bedroom window facing the field began to hum in its frame, a frequency so deep it seemed to come from underground. Then came the crack. Sharp. Final. Like the world's largest wishbone snapping in half. And then nothing. A silence so complete it felt carved out of the air itself. I ran to the back door, barefoot and still spitting toothpaste, my heart hammering against my ribs. The patio light illuminated maybe 15 feet of grass before dissolving into darkness. No smoke, no glow of fire, no neighbors stumbling out of their units to investigate. Just me and the field and that oppressive quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes, straining to hear something, anything, that might explain what had happened. A car backfiring, a transformer explosion, a jet breaking the sound barrier. But the silence held, thick and viscous, broken only by the distant hum of the interstate and the whisper of wind through the grass. When I finally went back inside, the digital clock on the microwave read 11:09. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the sequence of events, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a sonic boom, maybe a military exercise from the Air Force Base. These things happened in Texas. The state was lousy with military installations and testing facilities. But then I found the tracks. I discovered them during my morning walk around the property's perimeter, a habit I'd developed to fill the long stretches of retirement. Fresh tire treads pressed deep into the soft earth, but not along the road or the gravel drive where they belonged. These ran along the inside of my back fence, parallel to the chain link, maybe 3 feet from the barrier that separated my small rectangle of civilization from the field beyond. The tracks formed a perfect loop around my unit. They started at the northeast corner, hugged the fence line, curved around the back, traced the western boundary, and completed the circuit at the point where they began. Deep, deliberate impressions that spoke of something heavy and purposeful making slow, careful revolutions around my home. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was how the tracks seemed to end at the fence itself, as if whatever had made them had simply evaporated when it reached the barrier between my property and the field. There were no tracks leading to or from the loop, no indication of how the vehicle had arrived or where it had gone. I spent the better part of that morning walking the circuit, measuring the impressions with my foot, photographing them from every angle. The treads were wide and deeply lugged, suggesting something industrial, military maybe, or agricultural. But the spacing between the tire marks was wrong for any vehicle I could identify. Too narrow for a truck, too wide for a car, and the wheelbase seemed oddly proportioned, as if the thing that had made them operated under different rules than conventional mechanics. When I reported it to the complex's property management company, the woman on the phone listened with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to dealing with eccentric tenants. She promised to send someone out to look into it, but when I called back 3 days later, there was no record of my initial report. The woman I spoke to, a different woman with the same patient tone, suggested I might want to contact the sheriff's department if I was concerned about trespassers. The deputy who responded was young and earnest, with the kind of mustache that suggested recent graduation from the academy. He walked the perimeter with me, examined the tracks, took measurements, and filled out a report that would probably gather dust in some filing cabinet until the heat death of the universe. He suggested the marks might have been made by a maintenance vehicle, though he couldn't explain why such a vehicle would have circled my specific unit or where it had gone afterward. That night, I installed motion sensor lights around the property. Bright LED floods that would illuminate the entire backyard at the first sign of movement. I tested them twice, walking the perimeter until each one triggered in sequence, bathing the area in harsh white light that made the field beyond look even more empty and ominous. For a week, nothing happened. The lights never triggered. No mysterious sounds disturbed my sleep. I began to relax, to convince myself that whatever had occurred on November 1st had been a one-time event, an anomaly that would fade into the category of unsolved mysteries that accumulate over a lifetime. Then the wind changed. November 9th. I remember the date because it was a Thursday, and I'd spent the day dealing with insurance paperwork. One of those bureaucratic marathons that leave you feeling scraped raw and hollow. By evening, I was exhausted, barely coherent enough to microwave a frozen dinner and collapse in front of the television. The weather had been mild all week, the kind of false spring that sometimes visits Texas in late fall. But that night, a front moved in from the north, bringing with it the sharp promise of winter and wind that made the windows rattle in their frames. I was half asleep on the couch when the house began to hum. It started as a vibration in the walls themselves, so subtle I thought it might be the central air kicking on. But then the sound grew, deepening and intensifying until the entire structure seemed to resonate like a tuning fork. The vibration built for maybe 30 seconds, reached a crescendo that made my teeth ache, and then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The digital clock on the cable box read 11:07. I sat there in the sudden silence, my heart rate climbing toward panic levels, trying to process what had just happened. The house settling? Thermal expansion? Some quirk of the construction that manifested only under specific atmospheric conditions. But even as I ran through possible explanations, I knew I was lying to myself. The timing was too precise, too deliberate. The humming returned the next night, and the next, always at 11:07, always when the wind blew from the north, always lasting exactly 37 seconds before cutting off with surgical precision. I timed it, recorded it, documented the correlation between wind direction and the phenomenon with the obsessive thoroughness of someone desperately seeking rational explanation for irrational events. The humming occurred only when the breeze carried the scent of the field across my property, that particular cocktail of dry grass and distant mesquite, and something else I couldn't identify. Something metallic and sharp that reminded me of ozone after lightning. After 2 weeks of this nightly performance, I called the gas company. Maybe it was a pipeline issue, some kind of pressure relief system that engaged under specific conditions. The technician who responded was thorough and professional, checking meters and connections, and explaining how natural gas systems worked with the patient authority of someone who'd fielded similar calls before. He found nothing. No leaks, no pressure irregularities, no explanation for the phenomenon I described. Old houses make sounds, he said, packing up his equipment, especially when the weather changes. Could be expansion joints in the ductwork, settling in the foundation. Nothing to worry about. But this wasn't an old house. The complex had been built less than 5 years ago, and my unit was one of the newer sections. And the technician hadn't been there at 11:07 on a night when the wind blew from the north. He hadn't felt the walls vibrate with that deep, purposeful thrumming that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the foundations. I started staying awake for it, waiting, sitting in the living room with all the lights off, watching the digital clock on the microwave count down to 11:07, feeling my pulse accelerate as the moment approached. When the humming began, I would walk through the house, trying to locate its source. But the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the building itself had become a resonating chamber for some vast hidden instrument. One night I went outside during the humming, stood in the backyard with the wind whipping my hair and the stars wheeling overhead, trying to determine if the sound was coming from the field or from somewhere beneath my feet. But out there, surrounded by the immensity of the Texas sky, the humming felt different, less mechanical, more organic, like breathing. That's when I noticed the lights. Not lights exactly, more like the absence of darkness. Subtle variations in the blackness of the field that suggested movement, patterns that formed and dissolved too quickly for my eyes to track. They appeared only during the humming, synchronizing with the rise and fall of that deep vibration, and they seemed to respond to my presence. When I moved toward the fence, they retreated. When I stepped back, they approached. I bought binoculars, a telescope, night vision equipment that cost more than I could afford, and worked about as well as you'd expect consumer-grade electronics to work when trying to peer into the infinite. But I kept watching, kept documenting, filling notebook after notebook with observations that read like the journals of a madman. Wind speed, temperature, duration of the humming, patterns in the lights that might have been vehicles or might have been hallucinations born from staring too long into darkness. December arrived with a cold snap that killed what was left of the grass and turned the field into a wasteland of brittle stalks and bare earth. But the humming continued, punctual as a metronome, reliable as gravity, and the lights grew bolder, venturing closer to the fence line, lingering longer after the sound faded. I stopped talking to people about it, stopped calling authorities or utility companies, or anyone who might think I was losing my mind. Because maybe I was. Maybe the divorce and the move and the isolation had finally pushed me over some invisible line, and I was now the kind of person who saw patterns in randomness and assigned meaning to coincidence. But then came the night I saw it clearly. January 15th. The wind had been howling from the north all day, bringing with it the kind of cold that seemed to leach the color from everything. I was in position by 11:05, binoculars trained on the field, waiting for the show to begin. The humming started right on schedule, deep and purposeful, and the lights appeared almost immediately. But this time, they didn't dance and retreat. This time, they held formation, arranged in a perfect geometric pattern that stretched across perhaps 100 yards of field. 12 points of not quite light, each one precisely positioned, creating a shape that hurt to look at directly, but somehow made sense on the periphery of vision. And in the center of that pattern, something moved. Not a vehicle, not anything I could identify or categorize or fit into the comfortable boxes of rational explanation. Something large and patient and utterly foreign, casting shadows that fell in directions that defied the available light sources. It moved with deliberate care, tracing the same circuit I'd found impressed in my lawn back in November, only larger now, encompassing not just my property but half the field beyond. I watched for maybe 10 minutes, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the binoculars steady, as the thing completed its revolution and returned to the center of the pattern. Then the lights began to fade, one by one, until only darkness remained. The humming stopped. The wind shifted, carrying away the metallic scent, leaving only the familiar smell of winter and dead grass. That night, I packed a bag. By morning, I was in a motel on the other side of Lubbock, trying to convince myself that a change of scenery would restore my sanity. I stayed away for a week, hoping distance would provide perspective, that I'd return to find the whole experience had been some kind of extended nervous breakdown triggered by the stress of starting over. But when I came back, there were new tracks in my yard. Deeper this time, pressed so far into the earth they'd probably be visible from space. And they no longer formed a simple loop around my property. Now they spiraled inward, each revolution smaller than the last, converging on a point directly beneath my bedroom window. The humming still comes every night at 11:07 when the wind blows from the north. I've learned to live with it. the way you learn to live with tinnitus or chronic pain, part of the background noise of existence. But sometimes, when the sound reaches its crescendo and the whole house vibrates with that deep alien frequency, I think I hear something else underneath. Something that might be voices, or might be machinery, or might be the sound of something vast and patient settling into the earth beneath my feet. I've stopped trying to understand what's happening. Understanding implies the possibility of explanation, and some things exist beyond the comfortable boundaries of human comprehension. Instead, I've learned to listen. To the humming, to the wind, to the whispered conversations that might be coming from the field, or might be coming from inside my own head. Tonight, the wind is blowing from the north again. The clock reads 11:06. In 60 seconds, the house will begin to hum, and I'll know that whatever lives in that field is still there, still watching, still keeping time with mechanical precision. If it's a machine, it's learned to be patient. If it's something else, it knows my schedule better than I do. And sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, I wonder if that distinction matters at all. Story 13. The apartment in St. Paul held winter in its bones, even in late spring. I'd been staying there for 3 weeks, subletting from a graduate student who'd left behind more than just furniture. Books lined every wall. Occult studies, parapsychology, quantum mechanics texts with margins filled in cramped handwriting. I should have paid attention to those annotations. The pendulum sat on his desk, like a forgotten toy. Nothing elaborate. A brass weight on fishing line, the kind you'd find in any New Age shop. But something about it demanded attention, the way certain objects seemed to pulse with unspoken possibility. The glass beneath it bore water stains in perfect circles, as if it had been used repeatedly for the same purpose. I'd been alone too long. That's what I told myself when I picked up the weight, feeling its surprising warmth against my palm. The fishing line ran between my fingers like silk, and I found myself positioning it over the glass without conscious decision. Just curiosity, I reasoned. Just something to pass the evening. The instruction manual lay open beside it, pages yellowed and dog-eared. Place fingertip lightly beneath the weight. Ask for a clear sign. Observe without forcing. Simple enough. Child's play, really. My index finger found its place beneath the brass weight, barely making contact. The pendulum hung motionless in the apartment's stale air, and I felt foolish sitting there in the lamplight, waiting for nothing to happen. But as I formed the mental request, show me a clear sign, something shifted. The weight began to move. Not the erratic swing I expected, but deliberate figure eights, precise as if traced by an invisible hand. The brass never touched the glass, maintaining perfect distance as it carved through the air. I watched, fascinated, telling myself about subconscious muscle movements, about ideomotor responses learned in psychology classes years ago. Then the numbness began. It started in my palm, a tingling warmth that felt like circulation returning after sitting wrong. But it spread upward, following the pathways of nerves I'd never consciously mapped. My forearm grew heavy, as if someone had replaced my bones with lead. The sensation climbed past my elbow, settling into my shoulder with strange familiarity. The pendulum continued its dance, and I realized I wasn't controlling it anymore. My arm moved independently, maintaining the rhythm while my conscious mind observed from somewhere distant. I tried to lift my finger, to break the connection, but my hand refused. Not paralyzed, simply occupied by something else's intention. The weight traced larger figure eights, confident now, as if whatever guided it had found its footing in my nervous system. "Stop," I said aloud, my voice thin in the quiet apartment. The movement ceased immediately. My arm remained suspended for 3 heartbeats, then 4, before control returned with jarring suddenness. I jerked my hand away, knocking the glass aside. It rolled across the desk without breaking, coming to rest against a stack of those annotated books. My forearm ached like I'd held it above my head for hours. I flexed my fingers, working feeling back into joints that felt foreign, borrowed. In the lamplight, the pendulum hung perfectly still, but something in its brass surface seemed to hold residual warmth. I should have left it alone. Instead, over the following days, I found myself returning to the desk. Not to use the pendulum, I wasn't that foolish, but to study it, to understand what had happened. The graduate student's notes provided fragments, references to motor automatism, external agency, the willing surrender of conscious control. Academic language for something far more unsettling. The apartment began to feel different. Sounds carried strangely through the walls. Footsteps that stopped when I listened for them. Conversations just below the threshold of comprehension. The pendulum drew my attention constantly, a magnetic pull I recognized but couldn't explain. Even across the room, I felt its presence like a weight on my peripheral vision. On the fourth night, I woke to find my right arm extended toward the desk, fingers positioned as if holding something that wasn't there. The motion was precise, practiced, tracing those same figure eights in empty air. I watched my hand perform its choreography for several seconds before my conscious mind could intervene and lower it to the bed. Sleep became elusive after that. I'd drift toward unconsciousness only to jerk awake, finding my arm moving independently, searching for something to complete its circuit. The sensation of borrowed control lingered, even when I was fully alert. A presence hovering just behind my intentions, waiting for permission to step forward. I started wearing long sleeves to hide the subtle tremors that had developed in my right hand. Not palsy exactly, but a constant readiness, as if my muscles were tuned to frequencies I couldn't hear. Colleagues at the temp agency where I worked noticed my distraction, my tendency to stare at pens and paperweights with uncomfortable intensity. Any object that might swing, that might serve as a conduit for whatever had tasted control once, and wanted more. The breakthrough came when I discovered the previous tenant's journal, hidden behind the occult texts. His handwriting grew progressively erratic across its pages, documenting months of experimentation with the pendulum. Early entries were clinical, recording simple yes or no questions and their corresponding movements. But as weeks passed, the tone shifted toward obsession, then fear. It knows things I haven't told it. One entry read, "Asked about the job interview next Tuesday. I haven't scheduled any interview." But Thursday morning, the call came. How did it know? Later, my sister called. Our father's condition has worsened, just like the pendulum predicted. I never asked about him. It volunteered the information, spelling out words with different swing patterns. It's learning to communicate more directly. The final entries were nearly illegible. Can't stop the movements now. It writes through my hand sometimes, messages I don't understand. The language looks familiar, but I can't place it. Dr. Henley thinks it's stress, prescribed rest, change of environment, but it follows me. The brass weight isn't necessary anymore. Any suspended object will do. Even without objects, my arm knows the motions. It practices while I sleep. The journal ended abruptly. No forwarding address, no explanation for his departure. Just empty pages and the pendulum left behind like an abandoned pet. I began avoiding the desk entirely, keeping my right arm close to my body, conscious of every gesture. But the apartment felt smaller each day, as if the walls were contracting around me. The pendulum occupied more space than its physical dimensions suggested, its presence expanding to fill every corner where shadows gathered. My sleep deteriorated completely. I'd wake multiple times each night to find myself sitting at the desk, hand poised over the glass, though I had no memory of getting up. The brass weight would be spinning lazily, as if recently disturbed. Once, I found a sheet of paper covered with symbols I didn't recognize, drawn in my own handwriting but reflecting no memory or intention I could access. The symbols appeared increasingly often, sketched in notebook margins during temp work, traced unconsciously in condensation on windows, carved with my fingernail into soap bars in the bathroom. They felt significant, weighted with meaning that remained just beyond comprehension, like words from a language I'd once known but forgotten, leaving only the shape of understanding behind. 3 weeks after my first experiment, I woke to find my right arm completely numb from shoulder to fingertips. No pain, no tingling, just absolute absence of sensation. When I tried to move it, the limb responded sluggishly, as if operated by remote control through a poor connection. In the bathroom mirror, I watched my reflection raise its arm, but felt no corresponding neural signals, no confirmation that the movement was mine. The numbness lasted 6 hours. When feeling returned, it came with a flood of foreign muscle memory, techniques for holding writing instruments I'd never used, gestures that belonged to someone else's cultural background, methods of manual communication that felt simultaneously alien and familiar. I packed that afternoon, stuffing clothes into a duffel bag with frantic urgency, but as I reached for the apartment door, my right arm stopped moving. Not paralysis. Resistance. My hand remained fixed on the doorknob, refusing to turn it despite every conscious command I could generate. From behind me came a soft sound, the whisper of fishing line moving through air. I turned slowly, knowing what I'd see but hoping I was wrong. The pendulum spun in complex patterns above its glass, tracing symbols that matched those appearing in my unconscious drawings. No hand guided it, no finger provided support. It moved independently, confidently, carving messages into the stale apartment air. My arm relaxed its grip on the door, lowering to my side without conscious instruction. I walked back to the desk, watching my feet carry me toward the spinning weight. Sat in the chair that had been waiting, extended my finger beneath the brass, feeling its familiar warmth settle against my skin. The pendulum's motion smoothed, synchronized with rhythms I recognized from somewhere deeper than memory. My forearm grew heavy with borrowed purpose, and I welcomed the weight this time, understanding finally that resistance was not only futile, but unnecessary. The symbols it spelled were clearer now, their meaning accessible to parts of my mind I'd never consciously developed. Instructions, perhaps, or invitations. The distinction seemed less important with each passing moment, each figure 8 carved through the apartment's heavy air. Outside, St. Paul's spring rain began to fall, drumming against windows that hadn't been opened in months. The sound provided rhythm for our shared motion, mine and its, until the boundaries between intentional and automatic action dissolved completely. I should feel afraid, some distant part of my mind suggested, should recognize this surrender of agency as loss, as violation. But the sensation was oddly comforting, like finally relaxing muscles I hadn't realized were tense. Someone else could make the decisions for a while. Someone else could bear the weight of choice, of direction, of purpose. The pendulum continued its patient work, teaching my hand new languages, new possibilities. Through the apartment's thin walls, I could hear movement in adjacent units, other people going about their evening routines, unaware that their neighbor was learning to share his motor cortex with something that had been waiting a very long time for such generous accommodation. My phone buzzed with a text message I couldn't read with the pendulum in motion. Then another. Somewhere, people expected responses I wouldn't provide, meetings I wouldn't attend. That life was already becoming difficult to remember, its concerns fading like details from a dream upon waking. The brass weight caught the lamplight as it carved through darkness, and I understood that I'd been asking the wrong question all along. The mystery wasn't what had taken control of my arm, but why I'd assumed control was ever truly mine to begin with. How many of our daily movements were truly conscious choices, and how many were responses to influences we'd simply learned not to notice? The pendulum whispered secrets about the malleable nature of will, about the arbitrary boundaries we draw between self and other, between agency and automatism. With each revolution, those boundaries became less distinct, more negotiable. Rain continued against the windows, and somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. Footsteps in the hallway. Normal sounds of normal life continuing in a world where most people still believed their intentions were their own. I settled deeper into the chair, fingers steady beneath the weight, and waited to see what I might learn about the subtle choreography of borrowed will. The pendulum spun on, patient and persistent, teaching me to dance to rhythms I was only beginning to hear. Story 14. The thing about breathing is that you never notice it until something goes wrong. I should have known better than to buy anything in that cramped shop on Royal Street. The afternoon heat pressed against the windows like cupped hands, and inside the air hung thick with the smell of old wood and something else. Something medicinal that caught in the back of my throat. The proprietor, a thin man with fingers stained yellow from decades of cigarettes, barely looked up when I entered. His attention remained fixed on a leather-bound ledger, his pen scratching entries in a script too small and hurried for me to decipher. New Orleans has a way of making you buy things you don't need. Maybe it's the weight of all that history pressing down, or maybe it's just the heat making your thoughts sticky and slow. Whatever it was, something drew me to the glass case near the back wall, where small objects lay scattered on faded velvet like bones on a fortune teller's table. The pouch sat among them, no bigger than my palm, sewn from what looked like homespun cotton that had aged to the color of weak tea, hand-stitched with thread that had once been white, but now carried the patina of decades. Inside, I could feel small, hard objects shifting when I picked it up. Beads, mostly, but something else too. Something smooth and rigid that knocked against the fabric with a sound like fingernails tapping glass. When I asked about it, the proprietor finally raised his head. His eyes were the color of old pennies, and they seemed to look through me rather than at me. "Just a street souvenir," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had said the same phrase 1,000 times before. "Tourist trinket, $5. I should have put it back, should have walked out into that oppressive Louisiana heat and caught the next flight home to Savannah. Instead, I counted out 5 crumpled bills and slipped the pouch into my jacket pocket, where it settled against my ribs with surprising weight for something so small. The flight back was uneventful. I dozed somewhere over Alabama, the pouch forgotten in my pocket until I was unpacking in my bedroom that evening. Under my bedside lamp, I could see it more clearly. The careful stitching, the way the fabric had been doubled over and reinforced at the seams. Professional work, despite its humble appearance. When I shook it gently, the contents shifted with that same knocking sound, like small bones in a medicine bag. I set it on my dresser and thought nothing more of it until later that night. The smell came first. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when it crept into my consciousness. Sweet tobacco mixed with something else, something organic and earthy that reminded me of freshly turned soil. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong somehow. Wrong for my bedroom, wrong for the time of night, wrong for a house where no one had smoked in years. I sat up, switching on the lamp. The smell faded immediately, leaving only the familiar sense of laundry detergent and the faint mustiness that old houses carry in their walls. The pouch sat exactly where I had left it, innocent and still in the circle of lamplight. But when I turned the light off again, the smell returned, stronger this time, with an almost narcotic sweetness that made my head feel heavy. I lay in the darkness, breathing it in despite myself, until sleep took me under. The next morning brought no trace of the tobacco scent. I might have convinced myself it was a dream if not for the headache that lingered behind my eyes, the same dull throb I remembered from college nights spent in smoke-filled bars. I picked up the pouch, turning it over in my hands, but it revealed nothing, just cloth and stitching and whatever rattled softly inside. Work provided a blessed distraction. I spent the day reviewing contracts for the firm, losing myself in the precise language of legal obligations and remedies. The pouch remained on my dresser, and I managed to push it from my thoughts until evening approached, and I found myself walking home with growing unease. That night, the smell returned with the darkness, but this time, something else came with it. I was reaching for the lamp when I felt it, a sensation like stepping into a pocket of warmer air, except the warmth was inside my lungs. The space around my face felt different, denser somehow, as if the very molecules had been packed more tightly together. When I breathed in, the air seemed to resist slightly, like trying to drink through a straw that was almost too narrow. The lamp flooded the room with yellow light, and immediately everything normalized. The air felt thin and normal again. The tobacco smell vanished, and I was left gasping slightly in the sudden brightness. My hands were shaking as I stared at the pouch, which sat motionless on the dresser. I told myself it was anxiety, stress from the new caseload, too much coffee, and not enough sleep. All perfectly rational explanations for what had to be nothing more than a panic attack or a bit of sleep-deprived imagination. But when I turned off the light again, the sensation returned. That pocket of dense air around my face, that feeling of breathing through a narrowed passage. This time I lay still, forcing myself to remain calm, to breathe slowly and evenly through whatever this was. The tobacco smell grew stronger, so heavy I could almost taste it on my tongue, sweet and cloying with an undertone of something else, something that might have been leather, or might have been skin. I kept the lamp on for the rest of the night. The following day at work, I found myself researching the shop where I had bought the pouch. The internet yielded little. A basic listing in an online directory, no website, no reviews, just an address on Royal Street that I already knew. I called during my lunch break, but the line rang and rang without an answer. That evening I approached my bedroom with the kind of dread usually reserved for medical appointments or tax audits. The pouch sat waiting on the dresser, and I stared at it for a long time before undressing for bed. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to drive it to the nearest dumpster and be done with whatever psychological trick my mind was playing on itself. But another part, a larger part, if I was honest, needed to understand what was happening. The third night was worse. The dense air formed immediately when I switched off the lamp, but this time it felt more solid, more present, like breathing inside a small enclosed space. My lungs had to work harder to draw in each breath, and what came through was thick with that sweet tobacco smell and something else, something that might have been breath itself, warm and slightly moist. I lay very still, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sensation of breathing through a straw had returned, but now it felt less like a restriction and more like sharing, as if something else was breathing with me, its exhalations mixing with my own in the dense air around my face. When I couldn't stand it any longer, I reached for the lamp. Light flooded the room, and I sucked in great gulps of normal air, my chest tight with something between panic and vertigo. The pouch stared back at me from the dresser, and for just a moment, just an instant in the harsh electric light, it seemed to pulse slightly, as if something inside was moving. I was out of bed before I realized I had moved, snatching the pouch from the dresser with shaking hands. It felt warm, not just room temperature, but actually warm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight. The contents shifted inside with that familiar rattling sound, but now I could swear I heard something else mixed in with it. Something like a sigh, or the faintest whisper of air being released. The high shelf in my living room seemed like a reasonable compromise, far enough from the bedroom that I wouldn't have to see it when I went to sleep, but not so far that I felt like I was abandoning something that might, in some inexplicable way, need me. I set it carefully among the books and photo frames, positioning it behind a volume of legal precedents where it wouldn't catch my eye. That night, I slept better than I had in days. No tobacco smell, no dense air, no sensation of breathing through a straw. Just normal sleep in a normal room with normal air that moved freely in and out of my lungs. But normality, I was beginning to learn, is a fragile thing. The shelf began creaking 3 days later. Not constantly, just occasionally, usually in the evening or early morning when the house was quiet. A single sharp crack, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. At first I assumed it was the wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes, the kind of settling noise that old houses make as they breathe. Except it always came from the exact spot where the pouch sat. I found myself listening for it, counting the seconds between creaks, trying to discern a pattern. Sometimes hours would pass in silence. Other times, the shelf would crack every few minutes for an hour or more. A steady rhythm like a slow heartbeat echoing through the room. Standing directly beneath the shelf, I could feel something else. A subtle change in the air pressure, as if something small and contained was expanding and contracting just out of sight. When I reached up to touch the shelf, the wood felt slightly warm, and the creaking would stop immediately, as if whatever was causing it had suddenly gone still. The dreams started shortly after that. Not the vivid narrative dreams that you remember clearly upon waking, but something more subtle and disturbing. fragments of sensation that lingered in the spaces between sleep and consciousness. The feeling of fabric against my face, rough and hand-woven. The sound of beads rolling in an enclosed space. The weight of something small and bone-hard pressed against my palm. And always, threading through it all, that sweet tobacco smell, and the sensation of breathing air that had already been breathed by someone else. I would wake with the taste of it on my tongue, and lie in the darkness listening to the shelf creak in the next room, each sharp sound like a question I couldn't answer. During the day, I functioned normally, went to work, reviewed cases, had lunch with colleagues who noticed nothing unusual about my appearance or behavior. But evenings found me increasingly reluctant to return home, and when I finally did, I would find myself standing in the living room, staring up at the shelf where the pouch waited behind its wall of books. The rational part of my mind, the part trained to deal in evidence and logical argument, insisted that everything I was experiencing had a perfectly mundane explanation. Stress-induced hallucinations, sleep deprivation, the power of suggestion combined with an overactive imagination, and too many late nights watching horror movies. The tobacco smell could be coming from a neighbor's house. The creaking was just wood settling. The breathing sensations were nothing more than anxiety manifesting as physical symptoms. But rationality has its limits, and those limits were being tested in ways I had never experienced before. 2 weeks after moving the pouch to the shelf, I came home from work to find one of my books on the floor. The volume of legal precedents that had been hiding the pouch lay open beside the coffee table, its pages spread like the wings of a fallen bird. The pouch itself sat exposed on the shelf, somehow more visible now despite being in exactly the same position. I picked up the book, checking for damage, but found none. The spine was intact, the pages unmarked. Yet it had fallen, or been moved, from a shelf nearly 7 feet off the ground, landing with enough force to scatter its pages across the room. That night, the creaking came every 30 seconds with mechanical precision, like a metronome made of wood and time. I lay in bed listening to it, counting the intervals, trying to convince myself that I was imagining the pattern. But the rhythm was too consistent, too deliberate to be the random settling of old lumber. At some point during the night, I realized I was holding my breath between creaks, timing my exhalations to match the rhythm from the shelf. When I became conscious of it, I forced myself to breathe normally, but within minutes I had fallen back into the pattern without realizing it. By morning, the creaking had stopped, but something else had changed. The air in the house felt different, not dense like it had been in the bedroom, but somehow more present, more aware, as if every molecule had been arranged with purpose, positioned to carry sound and scent more efficiently than mere physics would allow. I started avoiding the living room. Instead, I would come home and go directly to the kitchen, then to the bedroom, skirting the edge of the room where the shelf waited, but avoidance only made the awareness more acute. I found myself listening for the creaks, even when I was elsewhere in the house, my body tensing at every small sound, every settling whisper from the old walls. The pouch was never far from my thoughts now. During meetings, I would catch myself running my fingers over my palm, remembering the weight of it, the way the contents had shifted inside the rough fabric. At lunch, surrounded by the normal chatter of colleagues, I would suddenly taste sweet tobacco on my tongue and have to excuse myself to the restroom, where I would splash cold water on my face and try to convince my reflection that everything was fine. But everything was not fine. The dreams were becoming more frequent, more detailed. I could feel the individual beads rolling against my fingers, smooth and cool like river stones. I could sense the shape of the bone, curved slightly, hollow like a bird's bone, with a surface that had been polished smooth by countless hands. In the dreams, I was always on the verge of opening the pouch, my fingers working at the careful stitching, when I would wake with a start and lie in the darkness feeling as if I had been caught in the act of something forbidden. 3 weeks after moving the pouch to the shelf, I broke down and called the antique shop in New Orleans again. This time, someone answered, not the thin man with the stained fingers, but a woman with a voice like smoke and honey. When I described what I had bought, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. The pouch, she said, had been in the shop for years, decades maybe. The previous owner had never been able to say where it came from or what it was supposed to contain. Just that it was old and had been made by someone who knew what they were doing. I asked if anyone else had ever bought one like it, and the silence stretched so long I thought the line had gone dead. Then she cleared her throat and told me that some things find their way to the people who need them, whether those people understand what they need or not. When I pressed her for more details, she simply said that if I was calling, then I already knew everything I needed to know. The line went dead before I could ask anything else. That night, I stood in the living room for an hour, staring up at the pouch on its high shelf. The house was completely silent. No creaking, no settling, no whisper of air moving through the vents. In that silence, I became acutely aware of my own breathing, of the way my chest rose and fell, of the air moving in and out of my lungs with soft, rhythmic precision. And then, very faintly, I heard it. A second rhythm underlying my own, slightly out of phase, like an echo that arrives before the original sound. Another breathing pattern, slower than mine, deeper, measured with the patience of something that has learned to wait. I held my breath, and for just a moment, the second rhythm continued alone. Then it too fell silent, leaving only the electric hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. I reached for the shelf, my hand stretching toward the place where the pouch waited in its nest of shadows and books. My fingers were inches away when the wood cracked sharply beneath my touch, loud as a gunshot in the quiet room. I jerked my hand back, my heart hammering, but the pouch remained motionless on its perch. That was 3 days ago. Since then, I have not touched the shelf. I have not attempted to reach the pouch or move it to a different location. I go about my daily routine, work, meals, the mundane business of living, but always with the awareness of that small cloth bag waiting in the room beyond. Sometimes I hear the creaking. Sometimes I catch the faint scent of sweet tobacco drifting through the house like smoke from a distant fire. And sometimes in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, I feel that second breathing rhythm synchronizing with my own, drawing in air that tastes of earth and memory and things that should have been forgotten long ago. I tell myself that I will throw it away tomorrow, drive it to a dumpster across town, and be done with whatever hold it has taken on my imagination. But tomorrow comes and goes, and still the pouch remains on its shelf, waiting with the patience of something that has learned the rhythm of human breath and found it good. The truth is, I am no longer certain who needs whom. The pouch came to me in that sweltering shop in New Orleans, but perhaps I came to it as well, drawn by some hunger I had never known I carried. Perhaps we have been breathing together longer than I realize, our rhythms matched in ways that predate conscious thought. Tonight I will go to bed and listen to the creaking of the shelf in the next room. I will taste sweet tobacco in the air and feel the weight of something watching from the shadows. And I will breathe in rhythm with whatever breathes alongside me, because some things, once acknowledged, cannot be ignored. The pouch remains on the shelf. The shelf continues to creak, and I continue to breathe air that grows denser with each passing night, as if something small and patient is teaching me a new way to fill my lungs. I have stopped trying to understand what is happening to me. Understanding implies control, and control is an illusion I can no longer afford to maintain. Instead, I simply breathe and wait and listen to the sound of wood settling under the weight of mysteries I am not meant to solve. Some things find their way to the people who need them. I am beginning to suspect I needed this more than I ever imagined.